We have a vacancy here. It's a problem.
It's a different lifestyle. Yeah.
We were
Very science. Like our neighbors were all doctors, attorneys, veterinarians, business owners. It was like a real nice, like every house was architecturally designed differently. So it was like a really big lots.
Good afternoon. I'd like to call this meeting to order of Township Board and Planning Commission Joint Special Meeting, July 13th, 2026. Please stand for the pledge. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, let's do a town board roll call.
Sure. Maura.
Here.
Julie.
Here.
Katie. Present. Becky. Present. Isaiah. Absent. JP. Absent. And Dave Sanger. Absent.
And there may be folks trickling in. We'll see. Planning Commission roll call, please.
Robert Eckstein.
Here.
Don Hornberger.
Here.
Julie Alexander.
Here.
Kevin Baird. Here. Susie Shipman. Absent. Armin Schanefeld. Absent. We have a quorum.
All right. As does the town board with Julie sitting in both seats. No governmental updates. Is there a conflict of interest for any member of the Planning Commission or town board?
No.
None? Okay. There is no consent agenda. I will entertain a motion to approve the agenda as presented.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and support. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Agenda is approved. Brief citizen comments for agenda items only. Come on up to the mic. You'll have 3 minutes. If you have questions, we will jot those down and we'll answer them during Q&A. And just state your name and address, please. Thank you. Dave?
Harold David Edmondson, 12414 Central Road, Heritage. I hate to say this, but again, here we are, a special meeting, very important. Very nice to have Mr. Polk here, Ryan. Know him very well, talked to him many times, got a lot of really good information. I hope you comprehend it and use it. The point I'm really trying to get to here is that we are in the middle of our cherry harvest. It is the biggest gig going out here on the peninsula as far as an agricultural activity, other than probably the wine harvest. And here again, we have a meeting where we need to have everybody here. And I feel it's just, I hate to say this, but I feel that it's very disrespectful that we don't put these meetings, these very important meetings on when people can be available for it. And I think to me, it shows over and over and over again how out of touch the town board is with agricultural community. And survey after survey after survey has shown that the people of this community support agriculture. PBR supports agriculture. Our constituents support agriculture. I believe that this board is supposed to support the constituents, not PTP, which it seems like you want to do. And another thing, Amendment 201, 95% of the agricultural community signed a letter before that amendment was put into place. We did not want it, and not one town board member respected that effort. And we're the people. You're supposed to be representing us. So I hope you listen to Ryan here, because he's got a lot of good stuff that will help agriculture. And another thing, guys like me, Freddie, Jed, 15, 20 years from now, we're not going to be here. So it's important to get something done today, not tomorrow. So we need to, instead of just warming these chairs, let's get something accomplished. Thank you.
Thank you. Just want to note for the record, Planning Commission member Susie Shipman is here.
Sorry guys, I've been meetings before.
John Wunsch, 17881 Center Road. First, thanks to Ryan for being here, and thank you, board members and officials, for setting up this opportunity to learn. It's especially, I think, important for each of you to get to ask him questions. I do have a few questions that I hope will be answered in this process. First off, does right to farm guarantee a right to process in the same way it guarantees other farm activities such as farm stands? 2, I understand RTF does not support restaurants, but does support farm-to-table meals. How do you distinguish the difference, and how do you recommend communities monitor, or if necessary, enforce limitations that would distinguish between the two different situations? 3, does RTF, Right to Farm, support event centers for activities like weddings or conferences? 4, if Right to Farm supports on-farm stays, are they to be for farm experiences like woofing, work on farm experiences, or just to stay like any short-term rental? And if specifically for on-farm experiences, then how do communities distinguish this from simple short-term rentals? What is your recommendation in regard to this? Of course, this is a question in regard to non-owner occupied buildings as opposed to standard B&B with owners occupied. And finally, do you and the RTF staff have any concern that adding agritourism activities beyond a certain level or type could contribute to increasing agricultural land values, pushing them further beyond what can be afforded as land to be farmed? May I give a copy to the presenter?
Sure, thank you.
Feel free to bring it up during the Q&A.
Any other public comment? Barring none? I see the agenda. I can't, sorry. Moving on to business. This is the joint special meeting between the town board and PC for an education session with our MSU Extension Right to Farm expert, Ryan Coffey-Hogue. Ryan, if you don't mind, introduction of yourself and kind of maybe a brief history, and then we can get to business.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Is that good enough for everyone in the back? Okay. So thank you for having me. I was up here a few years ago. My name is Ryan Coffey-Hogue. I'm with Michigan State University. I'm a faculty member, but I'm in the field with the extension program. And I'm located in Newaygo County. I've been doing this job for about 22 years, and right out of grad school. And my background, I'll try to give you the real brief synopsis of my background. I've got an undergraduate degree in physics, went to graduate school at Michigan State, kind of fell into this job. A faculty member that I was a research assistant for, we were actually researching purchase development rights programs at the time for the state of Michigan. Was offered this job. She couldn't take it because of her husband, so I took it, and here I am 22 years later. It was a great place for my wife to raise our children. We've got 9 children. And so some of my research, just so you know my background, when I was in grad school and beyond, I did research for the National Park Service, site selection for national parks, including Isle Royal. I've done PDR and TDR, purchase development rights, transfer of development rights research for the state of Michigan and for the entire country when it came to transfer development rights. I've done research, agricultural research, where the work I did went directly to the director of the Department of Agriculture for the state of Michigan and to the governor's desk. At the time it was Governor Schneider. We were looking at ag processing facilities in relation to workforce development in West Michigan region. We had originally done a study. I did a study locally on a 3-county level, and the governor asked us to kind of expand that beyond. Kind of an interesting study. You know, a nurse, phlebotomist, their job description's the same whether you're in Traverse City, Michigan or Seattle, Washington. A farm worker's job could be the exact same job but be different from farm to farm based on the description and the title. And so we were trying to standardize that and then also look at the economic value of different positions in terms of investment. Some of the biggest research I've done, I actually did research for the Catholic Church about 20 years ago. Those results were submitted to the prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith at the time, who was Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict. So I've done a lot of research over my years, and then this position has kind of led me into the field where I've done a lot of hands-on. So in my role, for 20 plus years, I'm an expert in planning and zoning, so I do a lot of that locally. But I also serve the state of Michigan on a variety of boards. The ones relevant to you would be with Right to Farm. So Right to Farm establishes GAMPs, Generally Accepted Agricultural Management Practices. There are committees. There's 8 of them. And I am the chair of the Farm Markets GAMPS Committee, so most of you are aware of that Farm Market GAMPS Committee. I've actually written about half of that document myself, so some of the questions like the gentleman had, I'll be able to answer very directly. I also serve on site selection for livestock, so you're putting in 500 pigs or cows. I sit on that committee. I also do the reviews for the appeals, so if neighbors complain about one of them coming in, I actually have sat on several appeals processes for those as well. And then I also sit on and have been an integral part of the writing of the greenhouse GAMP. And if you're not familiar with that, right now it doesn't exist. We're hoping after November it'll be adopted by the Ag Commission and then go into effect January 1st. So if you're a greenhouses person, there are some GAMPs coming for that as well. So we spent the last 2 years writing that. And so my role here, I think, is not only being an expert on Right to Farm and GAMPs, which I can tell you right now, if you call Department of Agriculture, if you ask them anything that's not GAMP related, like if it relates to zoning, they're giving you my number. Same with Farm Bureau. So I am one of the foremost experts on Right to Farm. So if I don't have the answer for you, I can get it for you. But I'm kind of at the top of a short list on that issue, which is why I'm here. But I also do a lot of work where Right to Farm intersects with local zoning. If I'm growing corn, it's pretty straightforward, right? If I've got a very large agritourism operation with 20 different things going on, then it gets a little more convoluted and, where does Right to Farm end, where does zoning begin, et cetera, kind of that intersect between the two. That's really kind of my area of specialties as well. So with that, the only other thing I'm going to say is as we go forward today, just really clear, I know that you're in the middle of an appeal for a big lawsuit. So regardless of what I tell you, even if I know it's right, and I've had to do this before where I know an attorney has given poor advice, not in this case necessarily, but in other cases, I can tell you what I believe or what I know, but you're in the middle of a litigation situation, so from a township side, if I say something that you like, but it's different than what your attorney says, talk to your attorney about it or go with your attorney's opinion. That's how you maintain your protection. Same for you as farmers, okay? If you're one of the farmers that's involved in the winery lawsuit, even if I give you other advice, I am more than happy to talk to your attorney. I've talked to both attorneys already over in times past during the last couple of years. But don't just change your course of action based on that if it's related to your lawsuit. I just want to give that, because I'm not an attorney. So I defer to your attorney's advice on that. And with that, my understanding, most of you have either seen me speak already or know me. There's not a need for like an hour-long overview of Right to Farm, GAMP, zoning, all that. I thought the best use of time would be just to kind of delve in and do Q&As and let the conversation organically develop, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So where do you want to start?
I will say, when we're done up here, there will be another public comment, so any questions that you have after all this discussion, please come up and ask. All right, PC, TB?
You could start with Mr. Wunsch's questions.
Sure.
On the paper there. And we
Okay.
can go from there.
I'll do that. And feel free to interject, cut me off, throw something at me if I got my head down, get my attention. I want to have a dialogue, back and forth. If you don't understand something or need clarification, let me know. So the first question I have is, does Right to Farm guarantee a right to process in the same way it guarantees other farming activities such as farm stands? I'm going to give you the short answer and I'll give you the explanation. The short answer is no, it does not. Right to Farm allows you to produce a farm product, to grow corn, to raise a cow. It gives you permission to sell that product. And to sell that product, it could be the corn on the cob out of the back of a truck. It could be blueberry scented candles, blueberry scented soap. Okay, as long as the namesake product, your farm product, is in it, you can sell that product. It can be grapes in a little container. It can be wine that you've had bottled. However, there is no inherent right in the Right to Farm Act for processing. And this is a question that the group prior to me coming on board struggled with, because I think there was an assumption that you could process, but the act itself is very clear. And whether the committee the GAMPS committee for farm markets wants to or not is irrelevant. We cannot artificially extend the intent of the Right to Farm Act because the GAMPS are subservient to the act itself. We'd basically be a non-elected body that was modifying the nature of the GAMP itself. So we have no inherent right to processing. That is something that is going to be locally controlled. Now, there are some state regulations on processing in terms of the procedures. They're fairly limited. There's a right to processing, a processing act out there. But in terms of right to farm, you can grow the product, raise the product, you can sell it, but you can't make it in your kitchen, in essence, like bake apple pies or blueberry pies and sell them. You technically need either zoning authority or to bypass that. We have no inherent right statutorily to actually change that, and if we did, I'll talk about this maybe a little later, but if we did, we would actually risk undermining the Right to Farm Act in its entirety. Every state in the United States, all 50 states, have some version of right to farm. They might not call it that, but they have it. Michigan has one of the top 5 in the country in terms of protections for farmers. The fear that we have is that if we were to push the boundary on that, there's literally one lawsuit that could destroy right to farm, or it could open it up. Southeast Michigan, for years, it's a very politically divisive law in the state. If right to farm were to get opened up, the fear is Southeast Michigan would gut it. And when I say gut it, take away a lot of protections that are already in the act itself. To understand the concern we have when we try to balance this, because our job is to provide nuisance protection for communities, but at the same time provide protection for farmers to be able to do their thing, okay? One of the biggest fears we have right now is the act itself defines farm products in a very elaborate paragraph, about that long, okay? Everything under the sun counts as a farm product, pretty much. However, when the act was amended in '99, the legislature did not use the word farm product, they used the word produce. The state Supreme Court historically tends to go with kind of what the common definition is. If you look up produce, it's basically fresh fruits and vegetables. The fear we have is we're one lawsuit away from, and I'm really dumbing down a pretty big legal argument here, but in essence, we could have a situation where an individual makes a complaint about a farm stand and argues that they have no right to sell anything but produce. If that were to happen, most farm stands in the state would be in trouble, okay? Because all these value-added things wouldn't count. Even the blueberry scented candles wouldn't count. This was such an issue. I discovered this issue about 3 years ago. I went to the head of the Right to Farm program at the time. He looked at me, and in the first 10 minutes, and this is someone I talk to 2 to 3 times a week, he looked at me and he said, "Ryan, you're nuts." About 20 minutes later, he said, "Oh my God, I think you're right. We've got a problem here." We arranged, so every department for the state of Michigan has an attorney general's attorney appointed to them, not the attorney general, but an attorney general attorney. And we met with her, we basically had an emergency meeting over this issue. The answer we got is leave well enough alone and let the courts figure it out. I think they know that this is a mess, and so we encourage, when there's a situation for farm markets, don't push your boundary if you think that this is going to be a challenge. Because if there was a challenge in court, this could devastate this situation. There's an easy fix. You open up the act, you amend the word produce, you just replace the word produce with farm product, we're back to where we are. However, opening up the act could be difficult, so right now it's kind of in limbo, to say the least. But just be aware that there is an issue with the farm market GAMPs in regards to that, and we do not have a way as a committee to affect that change. It has to come from the legislature. Second question is, Right to Farm does not support restaurants, but does support farm-to-table meals. How do you distinguish the difference, and how do you recommend communities monitor or enforce limitations that would distinguish the two different situations? That's a great question, and if any of you were at the first ag, MSU Ag Conference we had a couple years ago up here in Traverse City, right down by the bay, we kind of addressed that a little bit. What you're asking is this really gray area that we don't have a clear answer for, and here's why. With the GAMP, we intentionally write it broadly, so it casts a big net of protection for farmers, okay? For us to do otherwise, we'd have to actually somehow define a limit. And so what we've done is within the GAMP, the farm market GAMP, we have the word incidental. So you're allowed to do incidental marketing that help value-added sales for farm market. So the short answer is, the farm to tables, if you're doing these occasionally, they're going to be protected, right? You're using, but it's got to be tied. If you're charging my wife and I to come to your vineyard, and you're going to serve me, I don't care if it's local food, not local food, I'm going to get a meat, I'm going to get a steak, I'm going to get a whitefish, you're going to match red wines with the steak, whitefish, white wines, and I'm going to try 3 or 4 different wines of each, and then at the end of this, I'm going to say, I really like wines number 2 and 3. I'll take a case of each, right? That's part of that marketing, you can justify that. You're selling tickets for $50, $100 a pop, you're doing it 10, 20 times in the summer, you're probably fine. The example I like to give is this, and I'm just going to make up generic numbers. I've got a farm, $500,000 in annual sales, okay? I want to do this value added with the wine, farm to table meals. Those farm to table meals I offer a handful of times, maybe Friday and Saturday nights throughout the summer. And they bring in an additional $40,000, $50,000 of revenue. You're probably going to be okay. Ultimately, it's going to be a court deciding how extreme is the word incidental. But as an expert, I would testify that's incidental. Based on my knowledge of how we develop the GAMP, that would be fine. 10 years from now, your farm to table is so successful that you are now open from 11 in the morning until 10 at night, 360 days out of the year. Your farm sales have increased. You're now selling $750,000 in farm product. But now your quote-unquote farm to table, which is now a restaurant, is bringing in $2.5 million a year. Is that incidental to the farm operation? It's not, right? You're more than double. There isn't a clear delineated line in the sand. What I would recommend to a farmer and to a township is that if they're doing farm to table and they're doing it within a certain time frame, so many times a year, and they're directly tying the activity of the farm to table to the sale of their product, which in this case would be wine, then you're probably going to be fine under right to farm. But as a business owner of that winery, if you're telling me, look, this is so successful, I'm going to be a restaurant, I'm going to tell you, you're rolling the dice. Before you invest $500,000 into a structure, you better talk to the township first. Because if you don't, and they take you to court over it, you're going to stand a good chance of probably losing at that point because you've kind of crossed that incidental threshold into a separate commercial business, in essence. The problem you would have if your attorney was talking to me as the farmer is you would have to be able to show in your sales numbers that that operation is adding to your farm sales that's outpacing just the restaurant sale itself. And I kind of use it with any type of activity when we say, is it commercial or is it marketing? It's kind of, is the tail wagging the dog or is the dog wagging the tail? And ultimately, as a farmer, you have to be able to show in a court of law, if push came to shove, that the activity you're doing is marketing directly tied to the sale of additional product. So it's really easy for Christmas trees. I'm going to have a hay mound. I'm going to have hot chocolate and popcorn balls. I'm going to have a corn maze. I'm going to have a hayride with Santa or something, right? Well, I'm going to take my kids there and buy my tree from you rather than him because my whole family can go out and have this experience. That's pretty easy to justify. If you have a restaurant with $2.5 million in sales and your wine sales have only increased a couple $100,000, how do you justify that? I wouldn't want to have to explain that in a court of law. So there's a lot of gray here that you can work with in wiggle room. From the farmer side, where I tell you it's time to really start thinking about, do we need a permit for this, is if on the township side, they're coming down on you and saying, hey, wait a minute, this is beyond a farm to table, you're starting to look like a formal restaurant. That's where there needs to be a conversation to determine. And if you, in all fairness, you truly feel like it's farm to table and it's under right to farm, that's where you give someone like me a call and say, let's talk through this specific situation and kind of give me your impression. And I'll tell both sides the same thing. So, does right to farm support event centers for activities like wedding or conferences? Short answer is absolutely not. That's a commercial venue, it doesn't. The only thing I'm going to say on weddings, the township probably won't try to stop you if you're going to have your daughter's wedding on your property as a one-off, right? But the minute you're renting it out to me, him, her, everyone else, and it's a commercial operation, that's not going to be right to farm. I am aware of the testimony from the former interim director of the Department of Agriculture on this issue at the wineries case. I can tell you there was a collective gasp throughout MSU, the entire Department of Agriculture, and Farm Bureau on that, because we all know, and we would all testify that just doesn't count. It's the same as I want to put a hotel, separate from your question that we'll talk about in a minute, but if I wanted to put a formal Motel 6 on my property because it's for the winery visitors, that's a commercial enterprise, that's not going to be protected by right to farm. Right to farm does not extend. If you really read right to farm through a legal lens, it's very narrow. It lets you raise or grow any product or animal, it lets you sell it, and that's about it, right? It doesn't give you the extra permissions. So that's a commercial enterprise. And again, I think it goes back to my previous response. Where it gets gray is if I have a room or two, and I'm renting that out to the group of school teachers from downstate, and they're coming up for 2 days so they can drink and enjoy their wine, and they're going to buy wine. That's a really gray area. You may be able to justify that under marketing. You probably could if they're buying your product other than what they're drinking there. They're ordering wine, taking it home. But the minute you become once that exceeds that incidental component, and it becomes a full-blown hotel operation as a value-added commercial operation, that's going to be locally zoning controlled. So, and we don't see a way around that. Even if we wanted to, these types of issues, we could not put in the GAMP. There would be physically no way we would be artificially extending the intent of the law, which would be illegal on our part. We couldn't do that. So the only way you could get that into GAMPs would be you'd have to petition basically your legislatures to amend the Right to Farm Act, which would put in language to allow things like that. But understand the risk of that as well, right? Because you're now opening up the act. So, but that's really the only legal way it could be done. If right to farm supports on-farm stays, are they to be for farm experiences like woofing, or just to say that like any short-term rental? And if the farm experience, how do communities distinguish this from simple short-term rentals? This question is regarding non-owner occupied buildings as opposed to standard B&B uses. That's a really good question. It's a gray issue we run into a lot. It goes back to the same argument. Is the on-farm stay marketing? It's not just marketing the farm experience. Is it leading to more sales of the product? Okay, that's the key. If we're saying we want to do this on-farm stay where my kids and I and my wife, we come up, we stay on your farm for a week, we work it, because that's a big thing, at least down by us. People like to work farms, because they grow up in the city, they don't know what it's like. They want the experience. That housing would be outside of right to farm, because if they're taking money in for it, there's no farm product being exchanged in essence. To understand how nuanced this gets, under right to farm, you can have goats, no questions asked, right? You can sell goat milk, goat cheese, goat fur. You can sell goat candles, right? All this stuff. Can you have goat yoga? That's a gray area that those of us that are experts actually think you can't, because the act itself is very clear. There has to be fur, fiber, etc. If you're going in and you're listening to music, petting a goat, culling with it, it's a fun thing for a kid to do. It's a good stress relaxer. I get it. But if you're not walking away with that product, okay, then will right to farm protect? We believe the answer is no. Okay? It's a gray area. It needs to be adjudicated in court, but I would be probably 80% confident, not 100, but about 80% confident that if push came to shove, an attorney for either a complaining neighbor or a township could basically state, no, that's a step too far. We run into the same issue with horses. Is boarding protected or not? Well, you're taking a fee, but you're feeding them, you're raising them, you're grooming them, you're exercising them. You could probably do that. If I'm running them out just for riding, there's some gray area. If I'm breeding, no questions asked, right? The farm's going to protect you. But if I'm doing a horse show, so I bring people in, I've got a big indoor riding stable, I charge $25 a head, And 5 times a year, I do these shows where we come in, we rope them, we, rope cattle, we do whatever, horse shows, dancing, prancing, jumping, whatever. And then the people take their horses and go home. That's not right to farm. That's going to be commercial. Now, if at each show, every one of those horses were up for sale and there was sale of horses, then right to farm may come into play. And you have that right down with the big horse operation there with all the billionaires and royalty and all the rest. I mean, there's horses being sold there for millions of dollars each day. So, there's some right to farm protection potentially there. I'm not saying the whole facility necessarily is, but the nature of the transaction would cause it, as would breeding, feeding, et cetera. So that's how nuanced some of this can get. And I know it's frustrating and confusing, and it's probably like drinking from a fire hose, but that's how we have to walk through each case. Most of these are not just a clear-cut black or white, yes or no. And it has to do with the specific way the law is written and how the GAMPs tie to that law. That's what people miss, is there's GAMPs and there's the law. So for example, and let me give you a really good example with a farm market. Right to farm says you can sell your farm products, not a problem at all. The GAMP says you can sell if your farm market is on land you control. So maybe I don't own it, but I pay Dave $1 every year to rent a corner of his property, and I'm going to put my farm product up there. Can I do that, yes or no? In this case, the answer is yes, because he is on a farm. If I want to do this at the local Walgreens or a local house that has no farm product, can I do that? The answer is no. The reason being is the act itself says, and I quote, on a farm. So even though the GAMP tells you you can control the property and have a farm market, it's still subservient to the act itself, which says you need to be on a farm. Now, this is how, again, nuanced this gets. If Dave's got nothing but hay on that farm, and I want to sell apples, can I do it? Yes, because it's on a farm. It doesn't have to be the same farm product. Now, my farm market itself has to be 50% or more of my farm product, okay? But it doesn't matter the farm I'm on, as long as it's a farm. That's how intricate some of this gets legally, to understand it. So I hope that answers that question. It's not a perfect, there's more to it, by the way. So when you get into things like standard bed and breakfast, short-term rentals, those are commercial. There's no way around that. You're not going to be able to do short-term rental. The best you could maybe sneak by under right to farm, and I would not suggest it. I'd prefer to see some type of agreement between the township and the farmer that says, hey, we allow this at a small scale, scalable to the farm operation. In other words, we're not going to let you have a 20-acre operation and put in 100 bedrooms, right? But if you've got 100 acres and you want to put in 3 or 4 little overnight things, maybe we can work with you if we can find a way to make the ordinance do that. That would be ideal. If you don't do it, you're going to risk potentially letting a court decide on this. But if you can justify the scale of what you're doing as incidental to the farm operation, you may be able to get away with some type of accommodation potentially. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. I think you're really pushing the limit there. But if you do anything beyond incidental, you're going to have a problem. So that's where you need to definitely, try to hope the township has something that allows it, or work out some type of agreement with the township to allow for it if possible. But yeah, building Airbnbs, short-term rentals, completely out of the question. Do you and the Right to Farm staff have any concern that adding agritourism activities beyond a certain level or type could contribute to increasing agricultural land values, pushing them further beyond what can be afforded as land that will be farmed? I'm going to take a step back from that. First of all, I can't speak for Farm Bureau, I can't speak for Michigan Townships Association, I can't speak for the Department of Agriculture. I can tell you these questions have been asked. I think it's a more philosophical question taking a step back than even what you're asking. What you're asking is maybe the result of some of the philosophical questions. There's a reality, agriculture, if you've heard me speak on this before, I'll be very brief. Agriculture is really foundational to society. Up until 100 years ago, it was the foundation of a society. You don't have art, you don't have music, culture develop if you can't feed yourselves. Now, I'm going back to the early days of cavemen, basically, but you get my point, right? Not to belabor that. Since the last 100 years, Energy, honestly, is probably equaled and even exceeded agriculture, because now agriculture is dependent on energy much more than it used to be. But the reality is agriculture is very important, but unlike any other land uses, agriculture in itself is directly tied to the land. It's based on the soils, the soil type, the water access, in your case, the air drainage and microclimate because of the Great Lakes. It is something that is tied to land. Now, in fairness, we have many nice cities built on good agricultural lands, okay? And that's a reality we live with as we have the competition for land uses. And it makes sense in suburban areas around Detroit, Lansing, Grand Rapids, that you're going to lose some of that land for development, to build that development in close proximity to existing development. And it's why we try to discourage jumping of neighborhoods. Like I grew up in Saginaw area, Saginaw Bay City, Midland, back in the 90s. We were the poster child for urban sprawl. I mean, you'd have subdivisions going in a mile outside of town, and then they're running sewer and water all the way out. Livingston County in the 2000s is a good example of that as well. But traditional agriculture is tied to the land. And by traditional agriculture, I mean the animals, the crops, the trees, et cetera. The problem that we're dealing with is agriculture today is not your grandfather's agriculture, right? I had a grandpa, 40 acres and a plow back in the 30s. You can't make a living on that. You either go really big or you go really specialized. That was the trend we've seen for several decades now. Really specialized, think of the asparagus over in West Michigan. You know, their industry was collapsing at one point because of federal laws. So my farm makes Ryan's pickled asparagus, right? Instead of selling it to the conglomerate somewhere, I start doing value added. I make my own product and I sell it, get value out of it. As we go forward, and we've seen the trend in the last 20 to 30 years, agritourism has become part of that aspect of agriculture, right? For a farm to survive and to keep going, a lot of these operations, unless they're going large commercial, some of the smaller operations are turning to agritourism as a way to value add and offset risk of crop failure, et cetera, right? Or, you know, market changes. And in a way, I mean, I think it's fair to say agritourism is a weird stepchild of agriculture. It's got components of business and industry, it's got components of commercial, and it's got components of agriculture. So it's a weird hybrid of all three. But we're seeing farms over and over again nowadays going in that direction to help sustain themselves and to maintain the farms rather than sell off into housing development. Zoning tends not to keep up with a lot of that because the industry is moving year by year, and zoning takes time to address that. But there's also concern. So townships have a legitimate concern when someone wants to do something in agritourism, because agritourism is very widely defined. There's no state definition. And it can be something as easy as a farm stand. It can be something as complex as playgrounds and experiences. And, I've got one down in Grand Rapids, they're putting in the cannons for like pumpkins or whatever, where you shoot pumpkins out of cannons, okay, which is loud. And so there's a legitimate interest for a township when you're basically, in essence, putting a commercial use, what amounts to a commercial use, in an agricultural area. But at the same time, from the farm side, this is agriculturally related. And back to my bigger philosophical kind of point, is that, so we already mentioned agriculture is tied to the land. Agritourism is tied to the agriculture, right? If you're not growing the vineyard on site, and you're not going to have a vineyard, right? And so agritourism is connected to the agriculture. Agriculture is connected to the land. Anyone remember their third grade Socrates? If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Basically, agritourism is tied to that land as well. The trick is, and I think from the farming side, you guys get that, right? Like, you're not setting up an agritourism operation 10 miles away from your farm. You're doing it on site, okay? So you guys get that argument, and on their side, they've got the legitimate concern as a township that says, how do we allow this in a manner that's appropriate where it's not going to become a nuisance to neighbors? And that's ultimately, I think, kind of where some of the disagreement and the fighting is going, and we can talk about that a little later. But I think maybe more specifically with your question, we do have concerns about putting agritourism in the GAMP itself. Because if we do, we are breaking the state law. We don't have the authority to do that. The state law is really clear. The growing, raising of farm product and the selling, agritourism does not have a place in right to farm as it currently is written. We have several people on the committee that would love to put restaurants, hotels in it. There are other people that say, no way, we don't want that. It's a pretty evenly divided committee. I'll say that without naming names. But we all recognize we can't touch this with a 10-foot pole. We have no legal authority to do that. So agritourism is not going to be part of right to farm as well. In terms of the land value, we have talked about that. I think land value is a very complex issue. I just did an interview about 3 months ago for Bridge Magazine. There was a big debate between all the gubernatorial candidates about how local zoning is affecting land costs for building houses, et cetera. It wasn't as much about ag, but it was more about housing. And the reality is I don't think it's as big a deal as people think. I think local zoning, for the most part, you want to know where local zoning affects, local rules affect cost of building, go out to California. You will spend $80,000 to $120,000 before you even dig your foundation. Okay, because you got to do all these studies. I don't know what it's like here where I live. It's probably a couple $1,000s for the inspections and the whatever. But there's legitimate government interest for those. But I don't think that those rules are necessarily affecting the land values. Agritourism can add value to the land because if it's done in a manner where we have certainty of use, I can plan 20 years from now passing on to my daughter and there's going to be value there. Or I can plan on selling it to someone. One of the biggest problems when I get right to farm calls, and I deal with 20 to 30 right to farm calls a week, one of the biggest problems I run into is you get a situation where there's 12 things going on. 3 or 4 of them, 100% right to farm, no questions asked. 3 or 4 of them, 100% local zoning control. You got to go through local zoning. But the other ones are up in the air. They're gray. Some of those gray things we talked about. One of the things if we haven't got to the point where there's a lawsuit, we're going to court, there's a ticket issued, whatever, if we're still civil and still trying to work this through, is let's think outside the box and let's think beyond the initial issue here. It's this issue, X and Y, whatever they are. This is my concern. You might be able to push right to farm. You might win in local court if the township doesn't want to appeal it or the neighbor that's complaining doesn't want to appeal it. You might win locally. You're good to go. My concern is this. You're investing your life, as a lot of you do, your life savings into this. This is your business, it's your home, it's everything. At some point, I'm going to ask you the question, what is your plan? You're 60 years old right now. Your daughter's in California, your son's in New York. You're going to sell. Or my son is living on site and he's working it, managing it, and he plans on taking it over and he wants to pass it on to his kid. If that's the case, you want certainty of use. Because if you do have a situation that's gray and you lose, or it's not, let's say you didn't get a permit for something that legitimately requires a permit, you are going to be in a situation where you may not have grandfathering, right? And if that's the case, banks, since the late 90s, early 2000s, banks are very reluctant to finance anything that is non-conforming anymore. So if you're a house but you're in a commercial district, for example, that's the easiest thing. Think of it like a strip development on the edge of Traverse. They're very reluctant to do that because if they fund me $300,000 to buy that house and I go bankrupt or I die, I walk away or something happens, they're stuck with a non-conforming property that they can't sell to the next guy as a house. And so we're seeing some of that within some of these agricultural operations. It's few and far between, but for these farm market operations, when you have something that, hey, I turned my barn into a wedding venue and I never got a permit and the township's really ticked about it, but maybe they're coming after, maybe they're not. It might be in your best interest for the long-term investment of your property and the value of your property to say, look, I'm willing to go through that, spend a couple thousand, go through the commercial inspection and get that done because I have a long-term interest here. The other big part of that too, in terms of value, is someone wants to save a few $1,000s, they're going to build a brand new barn. The barn's going to be used for agricultural storage, but 10 years from now, I might want to turn it into a wedding venue. Okay, so the conversation is, how serious are you about that? Well, it's a pipe drain. Okay, build the thing under the ag exemption, don't get the permits, you're fine. Just know if you do turn it into a venue at some point in the future, you're going to have to go through commercial, because basically the litmus test for that is if public crosses the threshold of that barn, then it's got to be commercial code. okay? So if I'm running a farm market out of it, but the public is just coming up to the window, I can hire the 16-year-old down the street to work inside of it. If a big windstorm, straight line winds knock it down and the kid gets killed, I'm gonna be liable, but I can operate it under the code, the building code. But the minute the public walks through that door to shop or to grab an item or whatever it is, at that point now it's commercial. So my point is in terms of value, you're probably, if you're coming to me and saying, I want to do a wedding barn, and I'm pretty certain I'm going to do this is my long-term plan, my recommendation is invest now. Because if you don't, the few thousand you save from the building code exemption under ag might end up costing you $50,000 or $100,000 10 years from now. Because you realize you build it as a barn for agriculture, not up to building code, you're gonna have to come in, you might have to, your posts might have to be updated, your foundation might have to be updated, you might have to add ties everywhere. You know, why go through that if that's the plan? I always encourage you to think of your own investment long-term on that. So, does that answer all your questions? Yes. Okay.
All right.
I probably should have brought water.
Board, PC, continuation of questions? Or else this is going to be a really short meeting. Anyone?
Ryan, I was wondering, I'm Becky.
Yes.
Yes, I wondered if you've been called to testify in lawsuits.
I have.
For-
Yes, so my most famous one, actually, the state Supreme Court upheld my testimony many years ago. It was really bad. The guy was not agricultural. He basically, long story short, he had some animals outside, was claiming right to farm. He had a trailer that he had like a black water tube going out into a hole, so basically toilet water going into the ground. And he was using it for storage of chemicals and stuff, and he tried to argue that it was right to farm, and it wasn't. And he was making wood product on site, but he was bringing all his wood in from off-site. So it was a really open and shut case, but he had the resources to challenge it. He had legal protection from, he was part of the rail company, and he got lifetime legal protection, so he challenged it all the way to the state Supreme Court. I've been summoned multiple times. In one instance, the attorney, after talking to me, realized I wasn't going to help his case because the attorney didn't understand right to farm, and so he said, okay, I can't have you testify. I was asked to testify by one of the attorneys involved in your case. I don't want to say which side, but it was a very similar issue. It was really clear, based on my expertise, that it wouldn't help the cause of the side that was asking, and so I wasn't involved. I was consulted by both sides privately, but yeah.
Thank you.
Dave? Freddie, can you hold off until we get closer to the end? Do you mind? Thank you.
All right. Ryan, can you coach us up a little bit on the GAMPs? There's a lot of verbiage in there regarding the farm markets. How much of that language is advisory and how much of it is mandates that we have to follow?
So that's a very good question. So that was something, I won't go down the rabbit hole on you, but a little backstory will help that question. So for years, between Farm Bureau, myself, MTA, the Right to Farm program, we get inundated with so many of the similar questions that we wanted to be able to address some of these more common things in the GAMPs, but our concern was, how do we put it in the GAMP without making it, like, we want it to be educational, we don't want it to be part of a conformance standard. And so I took the lead on this with the Department of Ag, and we went, again, to the same attorney for the Department of Ag, and we actually requested a private opinion on this, and we wanted to know if we were to use an appendix within the GAMPs, and we were to explicitly say that these are for educational purposes only, they are not for conformance determination, okay? And conformance determination means you qualify for right to farm. So if I'm a farmer and I got a problem with the township, if we need to know if right to farm applies or not, we get a conformance review from the state, right? We didn't want to include these things in the conformance standards. So we asked, and we received a response that as long as we explicitly clarified the intent, that we could do that. And so we've been doing this very heavily in farm market GAMPs, very heavily in the new greenhouses GAMPs, and I'll just give you a couple examples. So conformance standards are in the document itself. And so a good conformance standard is like our location, right? If Thank you so much. If you are a farm market greater than 120 square feet, you have to be 165 feet from all non-farm residents. That's a standard. If you don't meet that, then you're not going to have right to farm protection. Another right to farm protection is the 50% rule, right? You guys have heard of that? Like, it's in the definitions, you have to have 50% or more of your products. So those are in the conformance. But in the appendice, we actually specifically say, signage. Signage is a good example. Under the conformance standard, we actually say you can have a sign, okay? Because we understand, we had townships trying to prevent. So I'm a farmer, I'm 2 miles off the main road, my farm market is away from the farm, I got control of the site, but I'm being told I can't put a sign up. Well, people aren't going to stop, they're not even going to know it's there. And so we say you can have a sign. So we do that very intentionally. We also say you can have a parking lot that's grass. You don't have to, because we've had a situation where a farm market couldn't open because the township wanted a $65,000 parking lot put in. This was pre-COVID, so numbers are a lot higher now, for literally a tent and a table, because based on their ordinance, you have to have parking. And so we say you can have parking, any surface. You can have a sign, one sign. But in the so that's the part of the control you can't control. If they want to have a sign, they can have it. If they want to have parking on grass, they can have it. But in the appendix, we clearly say, look, this sign, you can have one. But if the township allows more, you can have more, but you have to follow the regulations of that township. So I can't just go put up a 4 by 8 foot sign, like a billboard kind of sign. I still have to follow your square footage requirements. I can't put up a digital sign if you don't allow digital, or if you don't allow lighting. I have to follow your setbacks for the rules. The only thing you, as a township, have to do under the conformance standards, you have to allow that one sign. But your rules apply. With the parking lot, it's a very similar kind of situation. You have to allow parking on the grass. Like, we're not going to force someone, if you've got a, county road standard of like, this much subbase, that much asphalt, et cetera. We're not going to force that on a tent and table. And so we're going to let them park in grass, but they still have to meet your other parking requirements. So number of spaces, if you require handicap, whatever you may require. We're just saying you have to allow the surface, that's it. And we did this for multiple reasons in this appendix. One was to help clarify for the farmers and for the townships, but two is to keep these things from going to court all the time. Because who wins in court? Your attorney gets paid, your attorney gets paid, and usually the result is somewhere split in the middle and everyone's left half happy or unhappy. This is guidance, the intent here is this gives guidance to the courts to our intent as well. That look, we don't want, because we've had this situation occur where they'll say, well, you can, because they address parking or a sign, there's no restrictions. Because it's addressed in GAMPs, there's no township zoning exists. And our argument is it does. We ran into this very specifically, very close to your area, a different county nearby, where there was a court decision about 3 or 4 years ago with a hog farm, where the local judge basically said the farmer built a hog farm, put the pigs in, township tried to say you don't meet the requirements of the GAMPs because they don't address side yard setbacks. The judge basically ruled, well, the GAMPs address setbacks generally, they chose not to address setbacks, therefore they're preempted, local zoning's preempted. As experts, we all agree that that was not the right decision based on our understanding of GAMPs. Our attitude has always been, and we would testify to this, if it's not in the GAMP, then local zoning applies. So the signage, we allow one sign. If your ordinance says you can't have a sign, the GAMP says you can have a sign, it's in the GAMP, you can have a sign as a farmer. However, if you as a township in the same argument try to say, well, you have to make the height, the size, the area, whatever, the lighting of that sign has to meet our standards, and they're going to sit there and say, on the farmer side, they're going to say, no, it doesn't because the GAMP allows the sign, period. We as experts would say, no, it just allows the sign. You still have to follow the requirements that aren't addressed here. Does that make sense? Okay.
So I'm hyper-focused on Peninsula Township, so I'm not necessarily looking at other municipalities.
Okay.
How similar are we to everybody else? Are these the same universal questions and situations?
The issues, generally speaking, are very similar across the board. They're very wide-ranging. Yours is much more hyper-focused on specific issues related to the, you have a very unique situation here. You're on a peninsula with a microclimate, with air drainage, with the good fruit growing. I have not heard from your township any complaints regards to animals. It's been mostly agritourism related. So whether it's like lavender products or a winery, yours is more hyper-focused on that agritourism specific to your area. But in terms of the nature of the issues, they're very similar. The difference is yours is at a much more elevated scale, because in most cases I'm dealing with small farms, kind of minor issues we can usually work out. In your case, you've got very large operations with your wineries and multiple millions of dollars in each one of these operations. So the scale of what you're dealing with is amplified. But the issues are very similar. And we see this all over the state. We run the extreme to some communities have virtually no zoning, you can do whatever you want on your property, it's all farm, we don't care, to we're not gonna allow this at all and we're gonna fight it. Like the worst area in the state, we actually have, I don't think it's a public document, but the Right to Farm program has a heat map. So if you know what a heat map is, the redder it is, the more issue there is, right? And the greener there is, the less. Looking at conflict of right to farm issues. The greatest area is actually the greater Detroit area. Think Livingston County is the worst. And I do a lot of work down there because of that. Some of Grand Rapids area is pretty hot, some of Lansing as well. But it's where your suburbs are growing out into the farm country. And by suburbs, I don't mean a house on every 10 acres. I mean like subdivisions, basically. You know, you come out, that field looks really pretty in July when we build our house because it's a pretty cornfield, and then all of a sudden they're harvesting at 2 in the morning or they're spreading manure, okay? So, and that's ultimately why Right to Farm exists. So I don't think there's anything unique there. Ultimately, your rules come down to, besides navigating the line between right to farm and zoning, when it comes to the zoning, it ultimately comes down to, you've got a board, you're elected to make these rules, right? The Planning Commission develops them, they send them to the board for approval. And those officials are given that responsibility from the state. The state gives you a huge spectrum of how to operate. You can basically go from anarchy to communism, okay? I mean, literally, most townships fall somewhere in the middle, right? Where that balance is why you're here, and you determine that. And ultimately, if, you know, and I'll give a really extreme, I don't want to get into a big controversial issue, but Green Township down by Big Rapids, Goshen was coming in. Everyone familiar with that? That was the big battery plant, the Chinese battery plant? Okay. Basically, there was a situation where the officials went all in for the money, and the community said no, and then the community literally recalled all 5 board members, right? And then the pendulums shifted from one extreme to the opposite, where they basically said, we're never gonna allow this, and now they're in a lawsuit over that. Ultimately, it's your job to kind of find the balance of what works in your community. If I walk in and tell you, as an expert, this is what you need to do, every one of you, elected officials, appointed officials, and residents should tell me to hit the road. This isn't my community, I don't live here. I can tell you based on what your vision is, if you have a shared vision to say, here's the best way to get to this point. And, you know, I'll let you know if I think you're doing something maybe too extreme one way or the other potentially, but ultimately you have a lot of latitude, and there's, in your case, there's some differing of opinions, it's clear, right? I think the farming community, if I understand the situation without getting into all the details, they want much less, like more lax regulations. They don't want to have to go through special use permits. They don't like the minimum acreage issues in your ordinance. On your end, there's concerns about the potential conflict with something going in kind of every 5 feet, so to speak, not, you know, to overplay it, but, you know, every 5 acres maybe, let's say, and having just an inundation of commercial operations out in the middle of the residential area. And so you're trying to find a balance, I think. You know, you're trying to protect all the community. They feel, I think, that some of those clauses are a little overprotective or a little too much. And there's obviously disagreement. I think it's been amplified because of the lawsuit as well. That doesn't help relations. But you know, I think there are potentially some avenues to look at. I'm not saying it's a solution. It would involve give and take on both sides. It's not going to give everything the farmers want. It's not going to give the township everything you want. But one of the things I've noticed, just kind of doing, you know, because of my land use experience, planning, zoning, et cetera, I took a deep dive look. I looked at your zoning map. I looked at your map of all your PDR lands. You know, you've got the minimum acreage involved in that as well. You've got an ag preservation zone, which kind of defines where your PDR is going to take place. You know, without going through a massive rezoning, you clearly want to protect the open space in the farmland. That's clear, right? You've got a targeted project at that. Quite honestly, probably the best in the state. The only place that compares is maybe Kent County. Their senator at the time, Patty Burkholz, actually helped develop the PDR language in Lansing, and they had an aggressive program as well. You've got a good program, you're working on protecting it, but you're trying to balance, if I'm understanding township side, you're trying to balance that protection with the rights of the residents as well. You've got the mechanism in place to possibly maybe take an additional step. If you look at this, analyze it. I'm not going to guarantee it's going to work, but I think there's strong potential. Because you've already got a massive amount of your farmland in PDR, and we're talking what, 40% or more of your farms probably? 53?
54 by now.
54%, okay. More than half of your land right now is, if that's accurate, is in PDR. And it's in the ag preservation zone, which is targeted for that PDR. And most of this is large tracts of land. My understanding is a 5-acre parcel is probably not going to qualify for PDR unless it fills a gap connecting other ones, like making that continuous nature. Okay. One of the things you could do, and this won't satisfy all the farmers, but from the farming standpoint, they're in a PDR to protect the land for agriculture. They're facing economic challenges, and there are multiple ways to address the economic challenges, to be clear. It isn't just agritourism or bust. But if they see agritourism as a way to help preserve their farm and add value to their farm and continue on, and they want less rules or less obstacles to get to that point, it may not be a bad idea to consider taking your existing PDR lands, creating an overlay zoning district, okay? Like some type of special agriculture, agritourism overlay, whatever you want to call it. You can call it the Mickey Mouse district as far as I care, but basically take that existing PDR program and loosen the restrictions for that area. Because, here's the logic, that area is already permanently protected through the PDR, right? You're not going to have a subdivision go in. So the threat of even conflict with neighboring houses is much lower than areas that aren't in that PDR protection. Now, there may be some border areas where you need rules for setbacks, et cetera, because you're going to have a PDR up against potentially a neighborhood. And you may need to kind of keep an eye on those areas. But holistically, across that PDR overlay district, you could loosen up the rules so they don't have to go through as many hoops potentially to get those permissions there. Now, they would still have to do that outside of it because those areas outside, it's really, my understanding is it's kind of a balance of the economics of the situation, right? It's who's going to win out, a farm or housing development. I think your ordinance is fairly flexible for both. You're not necessarily rooting for one or the other. You're kind of trying to be flexible for either, potentially without them conflicting. But if you were to do that, one of the provisions would be if a farmer wanted those additional freedoms for development, for agritourism, they could join in the PDR program. So that would be an encouragement. So on the one hand, the farm could get the benefit of those less restrictions, but they would have to join the PDR. If they choose not to join the PDR, then they just have to follow the zoning as is. So it's not an all or nothing. I'm not like getting rid of one or getting rid of the other. We're kind of creating an overlap, like think of a Venn diagram, where you've kind of got an overlap in the middle where if you were telling me that this was, well, we've got 300 acres in PDR, I wouldn't even be mentioning this. But you've got thousands, if I'm understanding correctly, right? I mean, this could be a potential avenue to keep in place the rules you need for the areas that you need those rules. Again, right next to a subdivision. But then get rid of them for someone in the middle of 1,000 acres with nothing but a couple homes in them. It's an avenue. Now, I want to be clear. It's not going to be easy. You're going to have to do some work. Fortunately, you have an on-staff, I think she's on vacation right now, but you have an on-staff planner that could probably work through some of that. You've got your zoning, I think, administrator, assistant zoning administrator here too. But this is something that maybe could be a balanced solution. I would encourage you to maybe at least contemplate it if the ag community and the township are both amenable to saying maybe this is a compromise. Again, farming, there are going to be some farms, there might be a farm in here right now that this wouldn't affect. And then you'd still have to make the fight over the 60-acre, 50-acre minimums in the ordinance separately. But this is something I think that could give flexibility to the farmers in the PDR that can't sell off to a subdivision. It allows them to maybe sell 20 acres to a smaller agritourism operation. If you were to do this, my strongest advice, I would be less concerned in an ordinance, if I was advising someone, about minimum lot sizes, 60, 50, whatever, as to maybe a sliding scale. And the reason I say that is this. So I get to use this example because it's in my backyard, but we have Gerber Baby Foods. 800 employees, massive operation. I mean, it takes up acres of land. If I'm going to allow a farmer to do some egg processing, and they got 10 acres, right? I don't think I have a problem with them putting up a shed half the size of this room, say 1,000, 1,200 square feet. If it's a small operation, they're maybe distilling something, or they're, I don't know, making vinegar or making candles, whatever it is, as long as the impact is minimal. But I don't want to just give them carte blanche permission to turn that thing into the next Gerber Baby Foods 2.0, where now you've got a cherry processing facility, 35,000 square feet on 10 acres or something, whatever it works out, okay? And I think that's a good, it's one of the things when I look at your ordinance where I see, like, I see some understanding, so there's that provision in there that we don't grant permanent clause, like if we're going to allow a egg processing facility, because it's industrial, we're not just going to allow that carte blanche in perpetuity. If you're farming and using it for agriculture, if I'm reading your ordinance correctly, that's fine. But you have a provision in there to keep it from, so Dave sells to me and I say, hey, it's already an industrial operation, I can go build widgets and gadgets there. You know, something that's not agricultural. So I understand why you have something like that in there, because it protects that kind of industrial base from creeping in, which randomly, it almost looked like spot zoning at that point if you did that. So I understand those provisions, but I think maybe moving away, like where, you know, up to 5 acres or up to 10 acres is this many square feet and up to this, and have a scale, so you limit it. And then you could still potentially have the scalability that you have in there now with so much has to be from your site. 50%, 60, I don't know what your number is, maybe it's 65. But, you know, it allows some flexibility for product to come from off-site, but it's not going to, again, 10 acre, or let me make an extreme case. 5 acres is your minimum, right? So I have 5 acres and I've got 10 apple trees, and all of a sudden I'm bringing a truckload after truckload of apples from Washington State and shipping in them from China and Poland, right? I mean, because in theory you could do that. You could build, if you didn't have restrictions, you could build a massive processing operation. So having those restrictions in there makes sense, and it allows an operation to grow to a scale, and then at a certain scale, they either stay at that scale, or if they want to expand, they either need more land or they need to move the facility somewhere more appropriate, you know, if they want to make it, again, the Washington-China kind of comparison. So having scalability instead of acreage might make more sense. I think the one weakness I see in just the acreage, to be very blunt, is it's perfectly fine for large operators, not even a question. 60 acres is not a big deal. For a small operation, if I'm 20 acres, how do I start up? Because one of the trends, if you've seen me talk on agriculture, one of the trends we've seen, it used to be the 40 acres and a plow that I spoke of at the beginning. Now it's either really, really big, like massive, or it's very small and specialized. And so like in my neck of the woods, we have a lot of small operations on 10, 20 acres. We have a 28 acre operation, not very big. They supply goat meat to the Middle Eastern restaurants in Grand Rapids on a really small operation. So could something like that exist up here? Maybe not goats, but let's say if it's related to cherries or wineries. So I think that's the one drawback. And I'm not saying it's good, bad, or indifferent. You have every right along that continuum, that spectrum, to say this is where we want to be. And if they don't like it, they try to get someone else in your place and vote for someone else. And then change the rules. So it's legal. I guess my concern is, does it allow for the smaller operations? And I know the one concern, I think if I may say so, is the one concern from a township is we don't want one of these operations on every 5 acres up and down 37. Because you're going to have a lot of traffic issues, you're going to have accidents, you're going to have so many problems. And so what's that balance? That's where the ordinance language would come into play. I mean, scalability is probably one of the, I would argue, one of the most important, more important than at least minimum acreage in this case.
Questions?
You just touched on it, transportation. We have a problem here.
Yep.
That we're basically an island with one road. And, you know, how do we balance the fears that the residents have that being overwhelmed by agritourism will make it impossible for us to get in and out?
That's a great question. And I'm smiling because, so I grew up, we had a cottage up in Petoskey area on Walloon Lake. Going through Petoskey, you are geographically limited by the water. It's a linear path through town. It takes a half hour to get from one side to the other this time of year. Harbor Springs, same way. You have the same problem and then some. You have one road in and out of this peninsula, okay? So it's a double-edged sword on both sides of the aisle in this issue. On one hand, you're correct. Additional agritourism will bring additional traffic. It'll be periodic. You're gonna have times of the year, like right now, where it's probably gonna be crazy. You're gonna have events, like Fridays, Saturday nights probably, where it's gonna be busier for a couple hours. On the other hand, and let's go to an extreme. I'm not saying you guys are doing this at all, but let's say we just say, you know, we're not gonna worry about agriculture, we're gonna let this develop. 50 years from now, your grandkids are gonna hate you if this is nothing but subdivision. What's gonna happen is you're gonna have, because of the bottleneck of that road, what you will have is massive commercial development, probably right around this area, halfway out, because you're gonna need it. Because people aren't gonna be able to get in and out of town as easy because of that. I don't think you're ever gonna expand 37 into 4 lanes. I mean, maybe you could, but either way, you are very bottlenecked, very much so. So you're kind of, excuse the French, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. If this just becomes massive development 50 years from now and nothing but subdivisions, you're gonna have traffic problems way worse than anything agritourism is gonna bring you, quite honestly. Over the long period of time, and you're going to lose your agritourism. You're going to lose the beauty of the area as well. So I think trying to find that balance that we just talked about, you know, it's a delicate balance to find. And I know, talking to you guys want a balance. You respect agriculture and you want it to be here, but it's a difficult thing to struggle with because of the unique nature of what you're dealing with. On the ag side, they want to preserve agriculture, right? That's their livelihood, it's their lifestyle. And you've got people that live in homes. You've got to respect that as well. It's why I go back to that, maybe using like that PDR approach. If you were to use that, I think it's way better than a Band-Aid fix, because it's going to satisfy a large portion of the farmers and give them certainties going forward, give them additional use. But it's also going to help protect the subdivisions. The subdivisions that are existing, you're going to have to worry about that transition zone. But you're not going to have to worry about another subdivision going in the middle of 2 properties and then a winery going in next door 5 years later, or, you know, with an outdoor venue or whatever it may be. It's developers have an understanding of where they're going. To one of your points, you know, this idea that, you know, if I'm going to build a house, maybe not a subdivision, but I'm going to build a house and it's between 2 farms that are doing agritourism, I need to recognize that this is allowed in this new district that we create, right? In other words, you don't get to move in and then complain. This is the joke. Right to farm exists for one reason. You have people that live in urban areas, literally urban areas. They come out in the country, their 1 acre to them is like 40 acres to the person growing up in the farm. And all of a sudden they expect the same amenities, the same lifestyle, the same protections that you do in the city. Yet if we were to go into the city and say, hey, we want to put a 1,500 head hog farm right in the middle of downtown, like, that shouldn't happen. And for the record, that used to happen. Look at the history of Chicago. Chicago, like every rail line led to Chicago for a reason from the West. It was the slaughterhouse capital of the nation, right? So not real good for health, safety, welfare of communities to do that. And so it's a flip side of the same coin. You know, it's you know, to me, one of the things, and I don't know if you have this in your planning or not, if you're going to have denser development, there should be a requirement that it builds off of existing sewer and water, so that it builds off that infrastructure. And I'm talking tight neighborhoods, right? You know, if you're gonna have homes on 5 acres, not a big deal, even 2 acres. But direct the density towards one area, let it build naturally, organically off itself, protect that farmland. You're still gonna have some areas of conflict, but ultimately you're going to give more certainty of where housing is appropriate, and you're going to give more certainty to farming for the protection and preservation of their operations as well, even as they evolve and start utilizing agritourism as part of their, you know, I guess, economic plan, if you will. So. But the only thing I'm going to say on all this, you're in the middle of a lawsuit. I would not recommend either party's making major changes until you get this settled, because you got to follow your attorney's advice in this case.
To be fair, that is our attorney's advice.
Okay.
This may or may not relate to this, but you or your colleagues, have you seen issues by lessening restrictions to allow for more extra in ag zones, but then for whatever reason, the market or mismanagement or whatnot ends up closing all these things down, and they're left either in a blighted situation or it's affecting, real estate land values?
It's a good question. We don't see a lot of that. Where we see a lot of that is the temporary structures that can be removed pretty easy. In most larger operations, it can happen. I don't see a lot of it right now closing because they tend to be on the upward swing. But to be fair, I don't know your area economically well enough. Grand Rapids area, it's a growing venue, and the demand is through the roof. These places are expanding because for me, living in the city, to take my kids 10 minutes outside of town, they get the country experience, which is a joke where I live. I mean, we have bear in our yard, and otter in our creek. So it's like we are in the country, but for the people that live in the city, that's their country experience for them and their kids to go to the farm market. We're seeing increased use where I think most of the conflict is where we get into these, I wouldn't even call them gray areas. I would say they're zoning regulated areas where people want to have concert venues and big scale, large scale events that require traffic issues and noise, and that's where we have some farmers that are basically saying, well, I have right to farm to do this, and the township saying, no, you don't, and they're fighting it out right now. And I've advised the farmers, they really don't. In most cases, as long as the township ordinance is not just a blanket, like you can't be lazy and just say, hey, it's allowed, or no, it's not allowed. You put reasonable conditions in that control and all the rest, but you make the process smooth. The idea with economic development, back in the 90s, anyone remember City of Cleveland used to be like a dive, right? I mean, it was like a hole in the ground, like the Rust Belt. So the City of Cleveland came on television one time, and this is well known in our little world. I think their mayor came on and said, he bragged on television during an interview that you could apply for a permit to do business in Cleveland, and from the time you applied to the time you got the permit was 18 months. And like the whole world gasped, because that's ridiculous. The idea is to have regulations that if they're followed, government gets out of the way, they go do their thing. And as long as they're following the rules, they're okay. This is any type of business, right? It's not to extend the process or run up fees, and I'm not saying you guys are doing that, I'm just kind of speaking generally here. It's to say, here's a fair set of rules that everyone has to follow to achieve our community vision, which is basically your master plan. And as long as those rules get you there, then they should be able to apply, go through the process, get that application, and move forward. In most cases, what I'm seeing is townships are a little behind the 8 ball because some of this agritourism industry is moving faster than the planning world does. You understand, for those of you, some of you are on the planning commission, right? Yeah. This process takes time, right? There's hearings and there's notices, and it takes time. You want to do it right. You just don't walk in and adopt something tonight and then put it in effect tomorrow. And so it's a long process. But business, it's all about trying to, time is money. My personal example, in the early 90s, my father's business burnt down. He used an international builder. They had 30 days to have it open from the day it burnt. Otherwise, it was like $15,000 a day or something like that because of loss of revenue, okay? They had it built in 28 days. Because the township basically said, yep, you're doing the same, in this case, it was pretty straightforward. The township's like, hey, you're doing the same business, here's the permits you need, get them, we're good, and then built the thing. Just build it quick, and we were open in 28 days. So, and the idea is we don't want to drive away business. Like the city of Traverse City, for example, the last thing they'd want to do is drive business out of their downtown. So you want your ordinance to be fair, consistent with your plan, and easy to use. But I'm not seeing a ton of these where they become an eyesore, but they can. In fairness, the answer is just like any business. They can become an eyesore. I think maybe the best way to deal with that is putting a provision or two in your ordinance that addresses that issue. So for example, you already have the one provision, which I think is a good provision, that says, look, if you're an agricultural processing center and you've got our permission, you're good to go. But we're not going to transfer that industrial operation, as you call it, to building widgets and gadgets, automobile parts, right? Because that doesn't make sense out here. And so you've got a provision in there. You could potentially have an escrow policy or a decommissioning policy, if you will, that says, look, if this thing goes out of business for more than so long, it needs to be removed, and there's got to be a process in place ahead of time that's going to guarantee that, right? Some type of escrow or whatever. That could be done. If you're going to do that, though, I would encourage you to do it across the board with all businesses, not just agriculture, just to be fair. It is one way to deal with it. I don't think it'll be a huge problem for you, quite honestly. I mean, if the economy collapsed so bad that you were losing agritourism operations left and right, we got bigger problems than the old buildings. I think it's a growing industry for the time being, but it's always a concern. It will happen occasionally. Yeah.
Do you have, or can you point us towards some model ordinances for agritourism?
I wish I could, but the answer is absolutely not.
Okay.
So it's a great question. Someone asked me about 2 weeks ago the same thing. There's not one single ordinance I've seen that's great. There are pieces of ordinances I see out there that are good, but some of those also have really bad provisions as well in them. Most of them, unfortunately, are developed kind of historically the way your winery ordinance was. It was developed specifically for an industry or an individual. So we see a lot of these rural communities where they developed an ordinance specifically for that guy with the wedding barn or that lady with the lavender operation. And so it's very site-specific the way it's developed. It's not going to be widespread applicable. Right now, so it's interesting because Traverse City is the location of the Michigan Agritourism Association. Janice Benson, is that Michigan Agritourism Association? Okay, so she's on my farm markets committee, by the way. Love her participation. She's a big advocate for the agritourism industry. But, you know, when all this kind of started flaring up in 17, 18, when our committee was getting back together, you know, she was one of those that really kind of advocated for, is there something we can do under the GAMP to protect agritourism? Because right now, I have to deal with every township in the state. And we're trying to get something passed at the state level, but parties, right now, both parties are infighting, right? They're never going to all agree on agritourism. What's interesting is, you know, we have 1,250 townships, another 500 cities, villages. We joke and call it job security. We'll be doing this till the day we die, and our grandkids will be doing this because your boards change. There's so many communities out there. There's always a need. From the agritourism industry side, there is a strong desire, I think, if we could have something passed at a state level, a state statute that addresses agritourism, defines it, gives it protections. That's, I think, what the industry would like to see. I think that's really far off right now because of the politics in Lansing. So, as part of that, and there's a reason I'm taking a long way to get to this, it will answer your question. So what we ended up doing is all of us that are GAMPS chairs went to the head of the Department of Agriculture, the director, and we requested funding, since we're all volunteers, we requested funding for each GAMP specifically for certain technical assistance. They turned that down, but what they gave us instead was a new position within the Department of Ag, whose job is to kind of be the umbrella over all the GAMPs and be at our whim as we need assistance, technical assistance. As part of that, we had discussions, when I had asked specifically for our right to farm GAMP, we wanted what you just asked for. We wanted technical assistance to develop sample language for agritourism. That was one of our main goals, that townships could utilize and take with them. Because we didn't get that, Janice is developing, we had a proposal for this big statewide agritourism brochure that would deal with zoning issues, planning issues, economics, liquor licensing, everything. Kind of like if you're into agritourism, this would kind of address your issues. Because we could not do that collectively, it was going to be MTA, ourselves, Farm Bureau, Department of Agriculture, et cetera. Janice's group is taking a smaller version of that up right now. She's in the process of developing an agritourism guide that townships and farmers can use to help navigate agritourism issues. Within that will be some language recommendations. I've seen some drafts of it. What I've seen is pretty good, but I haven't seen the whole thing yet. So to answer your question the long way around, yes, there is something that will be coming at some point here with at least some guidance. But right now, there's nothing I could give you that says that's perfect. I think there's components of what you did, and please don't throw anything at me, guys out there. I think there's some things in your document you did that were good, that were really good. I think there's room for improvement. I really think the biggest issue is maybe the small versus large farms with the acreage and maybe scalability, and then doing some of these other, going maybe the route we talked about, saying, hey, if they're already in PDR, they're already committed, they can't turn into housing, we shouldn't have to worry about another vineyard going in or a farm market going in, because there's not going to be a neighborhood going in. We're not going to have a conflict. So I think that there's some improvements you can do, but I think Jen, and for those of you that aren't aware, so Jen consulted with me very early on her job. Right to Farm was like really new to her because she came from Colorado. By the end of it, I think she understood both sides of the issue, and I think she did a really good job in a lot of the work she did. But I think you're getting there. But I think that there needs to be a little give and take. If I were to kind of mediate this, I would be saying a little give and take here in some way, shape, or form, because right now you guys are kind of at extreme ends, and both with very valid reasonings, right? Farmers want to protect the future of agriculture, period. It's their business, it's their livelihood. You've got a community to look after. You've got to be able to protect everyone, not just one subset, okay? And so somewhere in the middle, I think that there is potential for compromise. And I think that if you get there, it's not going to be 100% everyone's happy, but I think it's something you can live with. If not, what I've seen, and not related to agriculture, to be clear, I've seen these types of problems in my career. I have a community I've worked with for over 20 years. The pendulum swings from one extreme to the other every election, and we don't get anywhere. Like, it goes one way, it goes the other way, and it has nothing to do with agriculture. This is all in wooded land. It has to do with politics and zoning enforcement and private property rights. But it's a constant battle, and I don't want to see that. I think you have too much good going up here. I mean, I'm not saying this because I'm up here to make you happy. Like, this is like one of the nicest parts of the whole country. Like, I grew up, I spent...
Everybody wants to move.
Which is your problem, right? So I spent, like I said, 5 months out of the year up at my cottage. We'd spend half the winter up there skiing on the weekends and all summer long. And this part of the state is some of the most beautiful country there is. And you've got very unique challenges because of the peninsula nature with the traffic, because of the unique microclimate for the agriculture. I mean, there's value here. I mean, if you were talking to me in the 1980s, I'd be like, why is this such a big deal? But the reality is your vineyards now are recognized worldwide, right? And so it's become part of the attraction to the area. So there is an economic driver, but with that comes the traffic, the noise, and it's a fun dance. That's why you get paid the big bucks to sit up there.
Did you have a question?
You said our document, are you talking about our ordinance, the ordinance itself?
Yeah, I suspect, I have not heard anyone complain about the master plan at all, ever. I don't think anyone has. I mean, if they do, they can mention it, but I don't think I've ever heard complaints about that. It's been more the nuances of the zoning as to how much, how little, and how do we.
I have a question.
Yes.
But it's not related to this. It's related, you talked about PDR.
Yes.
And you talked about working with TDR, PDR, so I know that you're familiar with our program. One of the things I wanted to ask is about concerns about if you are in PDR and you've reserved a building envelope. So I have a place.
I'm sorry,
a
reserve what?
building envelope. So I have a development envelope. I can have a house or whatever I need. Is there a provision within that that you can build the ag buildings that you need to be able to farm outside of that building envelope?
I think, let me start on the broad philosophical and get the specific. I think philosophically, the answer would be yes. As long as if you were willing to say, look, we recognize agritourism as part of agriculture, like in our definitions, then, allowing that would be fine. Again, we're not allowing 5 houses to go in just because, hey, I got my tax savings and now I want to make some more money and just put houses in. If it's part of the value added and it's tied directly to the farm the way you would define it, then I think you would want to make that generously available to farmers to encourage the protection, because they went into that program wanting to protect the farmland. You created the program to protect the farmland. If this is a viable option, I know it's not the only option, right? There's a lot of different economic components. Tart cherries are kind of dying out, right? So, if the only solution is agritourism, maybe you could put sweet cherries in, or something like that, or convert, or sell out, or whatever. I mean, there's different options to keep it in agriculture, but ideally, I think agritourism should be one option as long as it was reasonable in terms of the scale, right? We don't want it to just be a free-for-all. You want some basic regulations. But if you're going to do this in an area that's already preserved as agriculture, if you're willing to say, we're going to recognize agritourism operations to a scale as part of agriculture, again, not a 500-person hotel, but you get what I'm saying, right? You know, these kind of normal operations like you have out here now, you could potentially include that as part of the language and allow that within your PDR. And if you do that, it's just part of the agriculture.
Yeah, so if I wanted to build a barn, just a barn, or if I wanted to
Yep.
build a pole barn to store materials and things that they're all related to the operation,
Shouldn't be a
that
problem.
shouldn't be a problem.
That shouldn't be a problem at all. Yeah.
Hold on a second. I was gonna open it back up to the public. Do you guys have more questions? Susie, you're looking quizzically.
And if you have them, just bring them back to me afterwards too.
I will go one direction. The 50%, you mentioned that as sort of a performance
In the game.
element in the game. And with some of the conflicts around...
Susie, can you speak up a little bit?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thanks.
With some of the conflicts around understanding the definition of agritourism and how we balance those business interests for a farmer and protections and thinking about, you know, the future and whether we're opening the floodgates in different ways. The township looked at sort of applying similar language to the agritourism income.
Okay.
Do you have experience in
Yeah,
areas
so that's a good
going that
question.
direction?
So the 50%, the GAMPs are a really strange thing. It creates this really wide net of protection for farmers, but it's very narrowly applied, right? Like you got to fall into the GAMPs. We have a lot of communities, and this is something I see more and more out of communities where they're allowing agritourism and they're basically adopting the GAMPs language to cover the things the GAMPs don't in agritourism. So to your point, they'll say, okay, we'll develop an ordinance that if you're going to go beyond the normal farm market with 50%, you want to do these agritourism things that are definitely controlled by local zoning, we'll let you do that, but we're still going to put these same restrictions on you. So one of the restrictions, separate from what you're asking, is what we talked about earlier, square footage based on acreage size, so like sliding scale. But another one would be what you're saying, so that I can't just come in, buy land, not grow a thing, and just create a big old commercial operation, big fun house of whatever. You got to still be tied to the farm. Because again, the intent here with your farmland preservation is protecting the farm, right? Not the agritourism operation, it's the farm specifically that you're trying to protect. And most farmers will probably tell you that their agritourism operation is a value-added component of their farm. They're not just starting up an agritourism to spite the farm, or something that's going to eventually just eat the farm out and then the farm disappears. So to answer your question, yes, I would say I think it's very reasonable to put a standard like that in ordinances, and we do see that actually quite a bit. So the best example with farm markets, which maybe is a little more narrowly defined than what you're asking, is right to farm lets you have the farm market sell the product 50%, but some farm markets are really big now. They're basically like retail operations. Yeah, they have farm product there, but they're selling Christmas ornaments with the Christmas trees. They're selling whatever. And the reality of that business is now only 25% of their operation is their farm product. So they're really not right to farm protected. And so the local zoning will step in and they'll have a provision that says, you know, they'll put something in there, well, we'll let you be up to this scale, and if it's over this, it's got to be 50% or whatever. But they'll allow for protections or permissions, I should say, beyond what right to farm gives. In the reality of most agritourism operations, there's a reason I get 20 to 30 of these calls a week. I will literally get 7 or 8 on one day, because Erica, who runs the Right to Farm program, will check her voicemail when she's in the office and send them all to me. And it's just kind of the nature of the beast, because they get these questions like you're asking, which is beyond just right to farm. And it's like, okay, you got to talk to Ryan, you're dealing with zoning and kind of that intersection. And that's where you can be creative as a township. Now, you need to have provisions. If you just give a blanket permission, you give an inch, someone can take a mile, and you can have a mess. And I would be less worried about your situation where it goes under than I would, it just gets out of control, you know? Because again, like we're firing cannons 150 feet from neighboring houses, right? That's gonna be really annoying, going boom all day long, right? I mean, we can't allow that. That would drive you crazy. So, same with even music. You know, you're doing an outdoor venue at some type of agritourism, whether it's a vineyard or whatever, and you've got amplified music. That may be very appropriate in the middle of protected farmland where there's not a lot of houses. I do not want to be listening to Guns N' Roses at 2 a.m. at a wedding barn, you know, if I live 150 feet away from that's kind of the example I use, because you know who gets the call? She's getting the call at 2 a.m. as the supervisor, saying, why am I listening to Guns N' Roses right now at 2 a.m? Well, we've got a wedding venue there in a barn, and we can't help it. We've got no rules. So you've got to have common sense rules. It's not an all or nothing. Wedding barns is the best example for that. You know, Farmer A wants to do it. Hey, he's a good guy. It's a good location. I don't have a problem with it. But you know what? Farmer B's been talking about it. And Farmer B is right next to that new 80-home subdivision. If we allow A to do it, we're going to have to allow B, and we're going to get sued if we don't. And now all the neighbors are going to complain. It's not black or white. You can have that ordinance with those types of provisions that have variances in it and setbacks that say, here's where it's appropriate and here's where it's not. And if I meet it, I can do it. If I can't, then I don't. So, and I think you have some of that in your ordinance right now. It's just larger tracts of land. I think you're doing like the 60-80 and, yeah. So, does that answer it, kind of, I hope?
Yeah, no,
Okay, yep.
yeah, thank you.
Any other questions from up here? All right, we'll open up the public comment. So if you guys, I'm sure, have more questions, so come on up. Just be respectful of whoever's going to ask a question after you and give Ryan a chance to answer. Dave? Yeah, come on up. Thanks.
I wanted to follow up what Julie was talking about as far as PDRs. There is a provision within the PDR Township PDR program for changing types of agriculture. And if they're accepted, I think it has to be accepted in different communities and according to the board. So there is some flexibility for changing types of agriculture, such as farm stays and stuff like that, to happen on restricted land. There's a provision already in our.
And I would add to that too, right to farm allows, so I can go from apple trees to goats to hay 3 years in a row if I wanted to. It allows changes of agricultural use under right to farm. The only catch is if I were hay and I wanted to switch to animals, then I would have to follow the animals' GAMPs about setbacks, and so I couldn't just put cows right next to your house. But right to farm does have a provision for that. It would not extend to agritourism operations. That would be something you'd have to work in your definition or something if you wanted to do that locally.
But again, in the covenant, in the PDR covenants that we have at the township, there is that provision.
We'll double check, Dave.
It's there.
Well, like I said, we'll also double check and we'll see what Mr.
It's
Ryan
there, but I don't
Cotton
know if
says.
it's in like state or federal, but in our local, it is in that ordinance,
In your township,
in that covenant.
of all your PDR lands, how many are in the state program versus your township? I mean, are you mostly in your township program, I'm assuming? Does anyone?
Yes.
Mostly township, but some are double enrolled. Here at 116.
So they're all in the township then, and then there's a couple that are double?
There are some pieces that are not in the township program that are held by the Conservancy. There are some pieces that are PA 116, so they're not in the township program. Most of the things that are preserved are in the township program, and some of those in the township program are still enrolled in PA 116.
Perfect.
So it's a mix.
Yeah, so with the Conservancy, it's going to be like the contract as well, so whatever's in the language there, but.
And some have called their state in. So it's somewhat complicated.
Yes, there are some that there are.
And neither PDR program restricts the splitting of the land. The splits are based on the zoning ordinance only?
No, the newer,
John, you want to come up? Just, yeah. Not everybody can hear.
sorry. Some of the newer easements limit how many splits. We have found in the older program, we're getting a bunch of little fives cut off here and there. It's very hard to monitor. It does tend to fail to carry out the bigger mission of keeping land more viable for agriculture. So some of the newer ones are limited to how many, and nothing smaller than a 20.
Okay. Okay.
For those that don't know,
Although I will say, if they have a reserve site, which you've heard referenced, they can take a reserve site that is a 1 acre buildable area
Yep.
with added area as a part of it for buffer to meet the township's requirements for buffering.
Makes sense. So the practical application of that, though, is very few farmers are going to be splitting into 20 acres if you can't do agritourism under the current zoning. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, so just take it
Well, the current zoning requires 40, 50, 60 acres.
for processing.
Okay.
And for processing with rotation
Okay.
and then processing without proceeding.
Okay. With 20 acres, can you do like the farm markets, things like that if someone?
Yes.
Okay. So as a farmer, you got to really think about how you split your land, because even though you can split down to 20, it's not going to be very helpful if you can't do processing or whatever.
Yeah, and
Okay.
that's what they're gonna run into with that is the township's requirement for site, or the county's requirement for sight lines, the township's requirement for frontage. So I know with one of the, we recently have been negotiating, that's been a big issue, configuring it so that the splits that potentially come off of it would have the right to have a farm stand through the limitations of zoning.
Okay.
And to comment on Dave's comment, yes, there is a provision in the original, in the ordinance about adapting. It'd be a matter of a lot of community discussion, whether adapting to agritourism or whatever might be in there was part of that, but there is a provision that says that the board can consider the evolution of agricultural uses, and it cites, asks for, I think, 2 state or national organizations that also recognize that as valid agriculture.
Okay.
So,
for the record, your name, address.
John Wunsch, I'm the chairman of the PDR selection committee.
Okay.
Thank you. Don?
Don Coe, but I live in Traverse City, not in the Old Mission Peninsula, but I predate Ryan, because in 2007, there was a model agricultural tourism recommendation. That study was commissioned by Governor Granholm, and in fact, it was a 1-year setup of that committee. They published their report. The report was accepted by the Townships Association, the Municipal League, all the agricultural groups, including the Farm Bureau. And so there is a model agricultural tourism ordinance. You should look at it. And we repeatedly asked that your committees look at it. Now, talking about model ordinances for some of the communities around here. I've been working, I was a state ag commissioner for 9 years. We dealt every year with approving the right to farm and the GAMPs under right to farm. By the way, the right to farm originated in this township. George McManus, Senator George McManus, many years ago, when he was on the legislature, recognized the threat, and I suspect he was concerned about the threat right in this township with housing growth and development. And the legislation that we're talking about today, right to farm, was relatively new. It was absolutely new for Michigan, but it was relatively new for a lot of other states too. So we have a tradition of both right to farm, which came out of a senator who was a extension agent, ex-extension agent, who resided for many years in this township to provide protection from farmers. And George would be the first one to say, and when I talked to him over many years, when I've been working with townships on their zoning ordinances, George would never have said agriculture was not commercial. George would never have said that.
Don, do you have questions? I don't mean to cut you
Yeah.
off, but can we get to the question part?
I do have a question. If that's all true, and if the heritage of this township is both agriculture and tourism, and that's what you're dealing with. Is it not possible that in any zoning ordinance that is written, that the vision that you say needs to be in place? Is it not possible that the vision would go back to that heritage and that history and recognize agricultural tourism as a viable agricultural activity? Do you see that that's any way that that's not possible?
I don't see any problem with that at all. No, ultimately, the problem, I think, I don't want to say problem, what you're dealing with is, you're dealing with a state set of laws when it comes to planning and zoning that are at the discretion. I mean, you can literally go from one board to the next board and do a 180 swing. And so those changes can occur regardless of what your heritage is. I've seen communities that are completely one heritage do a 180 overnight with a change in a board over usually one specific fight or issue. I do want to address too, I think you're right. So I want to be clear, I'm not saying agriculture is not commercial. Agriculture is commercial, agriculture can be industrial, agriculture can be agricultural, it can be tourism. It's a weird combination of many things. I mean, a McDonald's is a commercial entity. A GM plant is a industry, right? You, as agritourism, are kind of a weird combination of all three, and that's that delicate dance that boards and planning commissions have to determine how much, how little, if any, where not. And that's statutorily where those laws lie. So the question that she had asked was were there any townships that had good sample ordinances? And my answer was no. I'm not aware of, I am aware, because I have that document you're talking about on my computer and printed out on my desk. Janice is using it as part of her guide for her agritourism thing as well. Michigan State promotes it. So if someone asks for a sample, we can give that out. It's a little outdated now because there's been some changes in agritourism that have advanced beyond that document, but it is a good starting point that can be used as reference. But I'm not aware, unless you are, of any township that's adopted that, other than it exists as a recommendation. Yes.
It's a guideline. It's a model agricultural tourism ordinance act written as a guideline for townships.
But have you seen any?
A lot of townships have adopted major, particularly definitions. But back to the question again, sorry.
Go ahead.
You have an opportunity now to, when you look at the work that your planning commission does, your AAC has done, your small farm committee has done, a number of zoning ordinances in the townships around us in just this particular region that share some of the same concerns that you had. The model ordinance that was written as far back as 2007, the GAMS that came after 2007, to adopt the best provisions, as long as you have the vision, to adopt those provisions. It isn't necessary for you to redraft everything again. And I would recommend to you, and quite frankly, I've been acting as a consultant with them, I would recommend to you that you look at the provisions that were recommended by the Citizens Coalition that has just been formed. And I know that gets people's...
Don, back to your question. Do you have
So,
a question?
will you look at, I'll just phrase it as a question, Mara, will you look at those recommendations? And the fact that you're having this meeting today indicates to me that you're willing to do so, and I appreciate your attention. But please, will you look at what has already been done rather than trying to reinvent the wheel? Thank you.
Just so the board and PC knows, those recommendations have already been at the Ag Advisory Committee for several months. And the 2007 guidance out of the ag tourism letter or packet, that's, I think, in the January or February 2025 Ag Advisory Committee meeting.
I would add too, I've seen those recommendations, and I think there's some good stuff in there to consider. If it was me advising, I would say maybe if you're going that way of like the PDR land, like we talked about earlier, maybe looking at incorporating that into those areas as well. I mean, just as a reference point. So there's some good work that's been done there.
Yeah.
There definitely is. But I still stand by what I said. I have not seen a holistic ordinance that's going to address everything out there. Too many of them, to Don's point, they take parts of the recommendations and they adopt them, but they only do it for what's relevant to their community. So there's good pieces of work, but you're not going to find a magic bullet out there, is my recommendation from what I've seen. And if there is one, please share it with me. So,
Other questions? Chris?
Chris Ball, 9707 Montague, Carolina.
Hi.
So you and I spoke a while ago about, and it very much relates to the small processing conversation that we had, and you talked a little bit about scaling.
Yes.
That's one way, lower than 40 acres. How do we allow people to do processing on site? Because, like I said, the nature of farming is either really big industrial farms, which we're probably not going to see a lot about here. It's going to trend in the other way towards smaller and specialized. So, and specialized usually is not just growing the ag product, it's oftentimes making it into something. And you said, I think in having farm markets, you said as long as the 50% rule of product in the things they're selling applies, they can have it made in China, processed into blueberry scented candles in China and brought back here and still sell it.
correct.
But that policy, and something you guys strongly encourage, is to have local townships and municipalities allow processing on site to avoid that logistics chain, to keep as much of the profitability on the farm as possible. So how do we bridge that gap to allow small processing on site to occur so that we can have creative, smaller agricultural entrepreneurs in our community, not lose the farmland if it's trending towards small and specialized or big? You know, and I appreciate the scaling comment of, like, if you scale it down underneath the 40, you know, so scaling is one option, but so that's my two questions. How do we, try to create smaller scale processing operations and not the agritourism, just processing of something on site and selling it? But also, my follow-up would be, are there any, not silver bullet, but are there any ordinances in the state of Michigan that you can say, oh, these guys are doing a good job of allowing small processing flexibility? So are there any places you can point us that are good solutions?
Yeah, so what I would recommend is taking a step back, and instead of thinking of it just as processing for agriculture, think about how communities handle home-based businesses. And I'm not talking the attorney's office in a spare bedroom. I'm talking the one that's in the pole barn. Small engine repair, you know, whatever you're doing out there in a pole barn. In rural communities, the idea of a good ordinance to regulate that type of activity is to make sure that we're allowing for someone to do a startup business, right? Because it's too expensive to go into the city, rent a building, and do this. They're not going to make it. But at the same token, I don't want you starting out with your son and daughter, in 5 years from now, you've got 50 employees and 50,000 square feet. So what we do is we do that scaling where we cap it and we limit the use and the impact of that use to the surrounding area, smells, odors, et cetera. We don't care what you're doing in there. I don't care if you're making candles, baking pies, you know, weaving baskets or whatever, you know, doing metal work, small engine repair, as long as it's controlled. Like, you know, we're not going to have 50 cars outside. We're not going to have noises and storage or whatever. So we scale it and we put rules around it that say, here's what you can do at this scale. You basically do the same for processing. You know, most processing is not going to be that noisy or that smelly for the most part with agriculture at that scale. If you're not going to allow it to grow to a point where it gets out of control, if your ordinance is done soundly, you can do that. And if I have 200 acres and I start small and I grow it bigger and bigger because I have 200 acres, good for me. The idea is we want to give you the ability to start up, get up, build a business, and be successful. And if you are on 5 acres and that limit is 1,200 square feet, and your business is booming, you got a decision to make. Do I need to buy more land? Do I need to take my operation into town to expand? Or am I happy with where I'm at? Because the township has the duty to protect the neighbors as well, right? So encouraging that, the way we develop ordinances, if any of you have been doing planning or zoning for more than 30 years, it was the litany list, right? Special use permit, you can do hair cutting and an attorney's office. Well, I want to do a tax preparation office. Well, that's just like an attorney office. There's no big deal with that but it's not in our ordinance, so we have to add it. We have to amend the ordinance and add it. I'm less concerned with naming the uses, whether it's a home-based business separately from agriculture or it's agriculture itself, as long as the rules are followed. In other words, we're not going to exceed the noise, the smells, the parking, the traffic, whatever our rules are. If you're going to be having 15 trucks coming in and out a day, full-size semis, we're going to have a problem. But let's put the standards in place and allow for it and allow you to grow and do your thing. That's kind of the way more modern zoning is going, getting away from the list or the litany and going to, if you fit in this container that we build, like you can abide by these rules, we don't care what you do as long as it's legal. Right? We don't want you growing pot in there if it's not legal necessarily, but or cooking meth or something, but, you know, if you're doing something legal that's within the law, you can do it, we're good with it. So, but yeah, thinking about almost like that home-based business, I think in your case, because of the nature of your situation, you may want to consider doing something specific for agritourism, which may include processing if that's what you choose to do as a township, because it's enough of an issue here where it may warrant its own specialized attention. But I think the approach from a legalistic perspective, from a zoning perspective, would be very similar to just any home-based business. Yeah, scale it.
And then are there any counties or townships or municipalities that are doing it right that you would want us to do for?
From the agritourism specific, I don't see too many. I can ask around.
Processing.
Yeah, I don't see, so, yeah, I have one township we wrote, but this is a little more extreme. They have a 40-acre minimum because they're protecting their ag lands, and it's only in a third of the township where the good ag land is. It feeds into Gerber baby foods. And so it's a 40-acre minimum. They have a single provision in there that if you have lands that aren't suitable for agriculture, I got 5 acres of woods, you know, it's muck land or whatever, you can put a house there or whatever. But they don't allow any more splits, but then they allow, the way they look at it is they look at it as, in our residential district, that's for homes. We let farming, traditional farming occur, no questions asked. But if they want to do these extra things like the processing, you have to go through a special use permit because it's a residential area. But in their ag district, they look at the ag district as, this district exists for agriculture. We're protecting it for agriculture. Therefore, we are going to allow these uses as use by rights, but with these scalable factors in it for scale. But we're putting it ag first, housing is second. Housing can come in, but they need to understand what they're walking into. I have another township where you can't even put a house in on under 40 acres. There's some legal issues with the way their ordinance is. I wouldn't recommend looking at that one. But there are townships that will do this, and they'll put language in. But again, it's up to you guys, and this is why, going back to why I think you've already got a mechanism in place with your PDR program. You've got dedicated ag land that you have said we're keeping housing out of. Why not make that a starting point and say, let's free up permissions in that district as a start, because that's an area where agriculture, we want to be in perpetuity. Otherwise, we wouldn't have bought those development rights, in essence. And then in the areas that are outside of that, then that's where regulations got to come into play, because you got that balance. You have to protect both sides. It's not a one-way street. You know, housing has as much rights as the farmers do, basically, in that sense. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Kind of reminds me of that ag business overlay conversation we had. Thank you.
Long Lake Township?
Yeah, or.
It was Long Lake.
It's Long Lake Township.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions? Ready?
I've been going on 166 Pike Center Road. You don't want to get in a situation where you're giving the people, township has a dog in this race, because you own 53% of the development rights on farms. You don't want to give those people rights and keep the people who haven't sold their rights restricted. That's going to give you a legal case that you make this thing look like a cakewalk. You do that. You can't do that. You can't say, oh, we know the development rights, we'll figure out ways to develop this, but these other guys who haven't sold them can't do anything with theirs, or we'll restrict them so they can. With someone. That's going to cause a problem.
I think, I would defer to I'll just answer that real quick before you go on. I would defer to the attorney on that, but in my experience, it's very common to do this, like with riparian rights or with agriculture. I don't think they would have a problem with it as long as they could legally justify how they did it. And I don't think they're giving additional rights because the crux of the conversation is including agritourism, however you define it, as part of agriculture. And therefore, it would fall under the existing rights of the PDR, is how I'm looking at that.
The other thing is that you got to figure out a way for these farms that you have development rights on to be able to cash flow and make money. Because you go ahead and let's take my farm. So I go ahead and have it appraised. It's worth $3.5 million. croak. Wife croaks. Go ahead and get it settled. Accountant fills out papers with the IRS. Bill puts it down as $3.5 million worth of value, it's a certified appraisal. At some point, heirs are gonna say, we gotta sell this thing. Maybe IRS pushes them. So you go ahead and sell it. You get somebody to come along and buy it. You go on to Greenstone Farm Credit Services and they say, it doesn't cash flow, we're not gonna do it. So the only one who's gonna end up buying it is the person who has enough cash to pay for it. The only way it's gonna get sold, so somebody comes up with $700,000. Okay? Get the check and give them the deed and get out of there. IRS says, what in the hell is going on now? What is going on? What? The development rates. How is the IRS going to look at that? How, they're walking away from $1 million worth of tax.
But that assessed value should reflect the lack of development rights, correct?
So, yeah. IRS is saying, how come there's such a shortfall between the appraised value and what it's sold for? Because of the cash flow.
Yeah.
That's one thing. The other thing is you guys have to be very, very careful on the development, on farm property, where we were talking about short-term rentals. When it comes to us guys who own migrant labor camps and have the opportunity to rent that to our neighbor, so he can house labor, get his crops harvested.
Do you have
You cannot infringe upon that right.
Yeah, do you have a separate ordinance that deals with migrant housing? I think that's outside of this issue, right?
It's probably with the Michigan Department of Health. They're the ones who approve it and inspect it. And I don't think your zoning ordinance can really go much over that.
Yeah, the zoning ordinance can actually control if, where, how much, if any. I've had to actually speak to the Farm Bureau executive leadership about this. Migrant housing is locally zoned. And then you're correct as well, once it's in place, then obviously the state.
I should be able to have the right to run it, and I should be able to have the right to go see you and rent your housing if I need some labor to do work for them, because I don't have it. Currently, we're doing H2A labor.
Freddie, I don't mean to cut you off, but do you have more questions? Because part of this could be taken offline with Ryan.
I was just pointing this out. This is an issue that you guys are gonna.
I'll just say this from the brief I know. If they have an ordinance that addresses it, then short-term rental shouldn't come into play. If you're using it as migrant housing, whether you're using it for yours or for your neighbors, unless there's a prohibition in their ordinance against that, you probably can do that. I don't think short-term rental would come into play. Short-term rental is I'm renting out my lake house to people for the weekends or whatever. That's a migrant housing issue under the migrant housing zoning. So as long as there's no provision preventing that, you should be able to do that, I would think.
I believe we're rapidly going to move into specialized chocolate black sweet cherry being moved into the fresh market. I harvest them. Johnson's harvest 50,000 pounds per meal a week ago today. Sold them to dollar cuts for 30 cents. It costs about 7 cents to harvest them.
Freddie, I'm not trying to cut you off, but we got to get to the questions.
I press my point forward. I've been running 1,500 pounds 2 days a week down to Clarity Auction, selling for $3 a pound. And you see where things are going. You're going to have a bunch of people picking up treasure in 15 years.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Denise Pelton, 10610 Elk Lake Road, Whitewater Township. I had some questions regarding, can you limit or put distance between farmers markets on a road or wineries on a road, can you say 1 mile apart or 2 miles apart or anything like that?
If it's protected by right to farm, no. You can't say that if there's one here, the next one has to be 1,000 feet away. Now, you could have an ordinance that says that, and if the farm market is outside of the right to farm GAMP, then that would apply. So in other words, it was doing more than just farm market protected activities. It was a retail operation. It felt, because I'm sure they have an ordinance that deals with farm markets in some way, shape, or form that aren't right to farm protected. But if it's protected by right to farm, if it's an operation under the Right to Farm Act, under the GAMPs, then if they meet the standards of the GAMPs, the ordinance cannot impose additional regulations for citing.
Would that apply to wineries as well?
It depends how the winery is operating, because there's a lot of different scales of wineries. If they are operating as basically like, let's say, a vineyard, kind of growing and selling, and they fall under right to farm protection, and that would be determined by the Department of Agriculture, then that would apply. If they are operating beyond that, they've got restaurants, rooms, processing, et cetera, then they're going to be subject to whatever the local zoning determines.
And then outdoor venues and amplified music or any outdoor music, does that fall, you said that doesn't fall under right to farm?
No, it's a little tricky now. I intentionally used the word amplified. So if you're going to have as a value-added marketing component, I'm going to have a guitarist play acoustic guitar while you're hand-picking lavender. And I'm going to go pick lavender there rather than down the street because, hey, I like the music, I like the relaxation. You could probably justify that under marketing. It would take a judge to determine it, but I think it would be a reasonable marketing activity to draw people in. If I'm going to have amplified music's off the table, that's it. Now, where it gets tricky is the dog wagging the tail versus the tail wagging the dog. We have a situation in Grand Rapids where there is an event where they do concerts on the weekend with like 500 people. And their argument is it's right to farm protected because they're selling beer made with their hops. The problem is they're charging ticket entrance to that, and they're advertising the concert. Ryan and the Rockettes coming in and playing the music, whatever it is, right? So the question I would ask, and this is not a question I would have to answer, I would want to answer in court if I was the farmer, is are people buying tickets to come to your farm to watch the concert? Or are they coming there and they just happen to buy your wine or your beer? Or are they coming there to buy your beer and they just happen to be listening to a concert? We all know the answer to that. You're not going to be able to justify that as marketing incidental to the concert itself is the commercial event. So it all comes down to that intent. And when amplified music comes into play, everything's out the window. Right to farm will not protect the amplified music.
Okay, and that would apply to wedding venues as well, then?
Wedding venues is even more specific. Wedding venues are a separate commercial operation. I am renting that venue for a wedding. I'm renting that venue for my business meeting. The venue happens to use farm-raised food, maybe all the food, everything, 100% is coming right from the farm. I'm not going there to buy that farm product. I'm getting that because I'm running it for a commercial purpose. And that's that distinguishing argument in a courtroom that if I was a farmer, I wouldn't, no pun intended, I wouldn't bet the farm on. I'd make sure I got the permits before I did that.
I was wondering, I looked at different townships, and some of them have, let's say, wineries on paved roads only. And if you have a township where there aren't a lot of paved roads, if you put it on a dirt road, then all of the people that used to have this quiet street now have another 50, 100 people, cars every weekend coming down the dirt road. Could you write in an ordinance that would say, you know, either your business is on a paved road or you provide grind road once a month to your business on a dirt road? Could you legally say that?
If it's going to fall under the jurisdiction of the ordinance, that's completely at the privy of the officials, whether they want to do that or not. Now, there's some weird nuances to your question. So, for example, let's assume a basic farm market down a private drive. The right to farm will not apply down a private drive. okay? You have the right to grow your product and all that there. Like if you've got a lavender farm or you're growing a product on the farm, you have a right under right to farm to grow it at the end of that private drive. But you don't have a right to have that farm market on there. It's going to be determined, because the best way to understand right to farm in like one sentence is, excuse me, just lost my train of thought, so bear with me, I apologize. Right to farm was developed to preempt local zoning only for nuisances. So if a liquor license is required, and that's a state provision, or there's a health department provision, or a building department provision that applies, that's at the same level. It's a state and a state, right? Right to farm is at a state level. Those other laws that are state level, they both apply. It's not an or, it's an and. When you get to local zoning only applies if it's not preempted by right to farm. So if right to farm through the GAMPS preempts local farming, then that GAMP, or the local zoning is going to apply. Otherwise, if the GAMP preempts, then the local zoning cannot be applied. So to understand that better down a private drive, if there's a covenant, like a neighborhood association agreement, homeowners association agreement, and it says very specifically it's for homeowners and visitors to your house only, no commercial allowed. Even if right to farm, you meet every standard of right to farm, you're not going to have right to farm protection for that farm market, because the right to farm is only protecting you from the local, not protecting you, but preempting local zoning ordinances. That legal contract is a private contract outside of right to farm, outside of your local zoning. It's between the homeowners that live down there, and if you violate it, you're going to have a problem. Just dealt with the case down in Grand Rapids area earlier this year with the lavender farm about that. And so those rules are going to apply. And it's an interesting question as well, because we actually only, if you read through the language real close, it actually uses the word public roads. So like how it applies to a public road is different. It's going to be very different than a private road as well. And whether it's a permanent, this is again that nuance we talked about earlier. If it's a permanent structure, like foundation, whatever on the ground, versus a temporary, and by temporary I mean a tent and a table, it's a whole different set of rules. I would argue right to farm allows you to have that tent and the table right up to the edge of the road pretty much, the way it's written. It really does. You can be in the road right away. But if it's a permanent structure, because it's controlled by the building code, which is referenced in the act, then local zoning is going to apply. So from a local zoning perspective, if I want to put up a 1,200 square foot structure with cement floor, or just sticks in the ground or something, I'm going to have to follow all your setbacks. And if you say I have to be this many feet from the road right away, so be it. However, if I want to put up a tent and a table, I would be really careful with saying, well, you have to be 120 feet from the road, because the way the act is written, I actually think you could have that thing right on the side of the road. And I think that was the intent of the way it was developed, because when you think of your area, where were all the cherries set up? I remember as a kid driving up, like literally right on the edge of the road, right? They weren't beyond the road right away and then 100 feet back or something. So it's going to depend on the nature of the road. But if it's outside of right to farm, to your point, yeah, they could space it out, say every 1,000 feet. They could say only on primary roads. We do that a lot with other types of commercial development and zoning all the time. We even do it for denser housing development. You got to be 10 acres if you're down the dirt road, but if you're up on the main road, we'll give you 2 acres because it can handle the traffic. So, does that answer that?
It's very helpful because the property rights.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Other questions? Chris?
Chris Spiker, 2437 Crowell Road. Learned a lot just by sitting here with you and going through some things. I've had a few meetings at the township. It's kind of a loaded deal, but we're talking about processing facilities and PDR land, things of that nature and everything. Right now, like within the wine industry, there's not a lot of grapes being purchased locally here right now. We're lucky enough not to put bad vibes for people downstate, but they get frosted out and everything else, so I don't think we're going to have a problem getting rid of our grapes this year. But the money's in the bottle, so to speak. So, you know, and there's people out here that have smaller vineyards and everything, and they're trying to, you know, market their product. But yet, you know, not from a processing end of it. And I've spoken about this a little bit about possibly, and I don't know if you've run into this, where they've maybe done a blanket type of thing where, you know, it's been talked about for years out here about doing a community custom crush pad, which everybody talks about it, but it never goes anywhere, and there's a lot involved with that. But for that, you know, there's some of these people with these smaller vineyards and everything would have the capability of being able to do that, possibly be able to store their wine at a proper facility. It's not going all over the place. It's not, you know, bonding and everything else going all over the place. If that's something that you've run into where it's lavender or somebody's making oils or whatever, that kind of thing, where they can share within it. I mean, we're out here talking about trying to preserve land and property and everything, and if it's on a spot where it's not, you know, houses aren't smack dab right next to anything or anything like that, where, you know, we're talking about, you know, maybe breaking down the minimums on some of the properties, what it would have to be, or we could still keep it at that, but then people would still have the opportunities to do this, and, you know, we can keep everybody off the corridor and everything else, and building, you know, if they, you know, there's other ways around this, but.
So yeah, there are other agricultural industries that do that. I wouldn't say it's a new idea, but I think it's a creative idea for the farmers to, you know, if that's something that they think would be economically viable. You know, I can't speak for the township, but I would hope maybe the township could work with you to identify a site that says, okay, here's where we'd like to do this. You're talking almost like a co-op or collective.
Yeah, something within that, but I mean, there's a lot more.
If that could be done, I mean, that's a creative way to save costs and to preserve, you know, to keep from having to have everyone have their own little processing center. I think it's a very reasonable, you know, regionally in West Michigan, we actually have two different, one's called the Starting Block, and they were a community investment. We got some state funding, but basically you can go there and do what you want to do. It's almost like it's way more than a commercial kitchen. You can do processing, bottling, et cetera. You can do these types of things, and it's like a community asset. You're talking about basically the same type of thing, but maybe privately owned and maybe targeted more towards specific industry. Sure. I don't see why you couldn't do that, and it would be a creative solution if it was viable to make this work. Again, thinking outside the box, it's not a bad idea. We've seen that at a large scale. I mean, Michigan Sugar is like that over in Bay City. You know, it's owned by the farmers, and I grew up not too far from there. Now that's a large operation, obviously. That's industrial size. But I don't see why that couldn't be possible potentially. And if you had enough farmers buy into it, it would probably alleviate a lot of the pressure on the township to have to worry about, geez, we got to have one of these every 1,500 feet up and down the roads.
Yeah, not even something like that, even from a standpoint of even, you know, the tasting rooms or that type of thing where they can be condensed into a smaller portion or whatever, be it out here, be it downtown or wherever. You know, there's a lot of ways to be able to get around these stories about how much traffic is the wineries versus nobody can mow their own lawns out here. But yeah, that's just kind of
I think it's a good idea. I don't think you'll get everyone involved because you have such difference of scale, but it's a potential solution that you could talk about as farmers and bring to the township to see if it's something that's viable, but.
Sure. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Kevin?
Follow up on that idea. Would you recommend that the township have some enabling language in the code to permit something like that? A cooperative effort of some sort?
If and only if, one, that's something that's even viable from the farmer's standpoint that they come to you and ask, and then two, if it's acceptable to you as a township as well, right? I mean, you've got to look at that and say, is this something that we're willing to accept? And if the answer is, yeah, that makes sense, then you could put some language in there that would do it. But if you're looking at that saying, no, we think that's going to be more problems than it's worth, it's your call as a township. It's your discretion as officials.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Boards, commissions? Ryan, do you have any parting thoughts?
No, I think we covered a lot, and everyone knows how to get a hold of me if they have follow-ups, or I can stick around for a little bit.
That
but,
would be very helpful.
Yeah.
We'll keep the ear on in here for whoever wants to talk to Ryan one-on-one, and for anyone that's listening, maybe non-ag folks that have questions for him, you can get a hold of him directly, or if you want to send it through me, I have no problem sharing it, so no problems. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Any final town board comments?
Just appreciate all the interest in the community. Thank you for coming out today, those of you who were able to make it. And Ryan, thanks.
Yeah, I will just add too, I know we drank from a fire hose today.
Yeah.
There's a lot, so follow up with me. If there's something specific that comes up, this is not an easy situation. That's why I'm here in the first place.
Yes.
This is a very complex issue, so if you need follow up, please.
And the greenhouse GAMPs are expected in the new year, it sounds like.
They are going to be available at the last couple of days of the month on MDARD's Right to Farm page for review. They will go before the Ag Commission in November, and if adopted, they will go into effect January 1.
Wonderful, thanks. Thank you.
The video from this, can it be preserved?
Yes.
We very rarely get this kind of expertise, and to think that the video would be gone in 30 days would be disappointing. We should be able to reference it again at some point.
We will preserve it, and other townships and municipalities are watching and have asked for the same thing.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Is it audio only or is there video?
Video.
Oh,
Yep. Yep. I'll send you the YouTube.
Oh.
Yeah.
It's way back there.
It's got a good zoom.
Does he has any final comments?
Any comments from the Planning
I
Commission?
thought it was great.
No, it's helpful.
Yep. Appreciate your time.
I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second. We have motion and with support. All in favor?
Aye.
We're adjourned. Thank you.
I want to go back outside. Sizzle.